Right now, across the UK, something strange is happening in the rental market. The North East is seeing rents surge by over 9% in just 12 months, yet at the same time, experts are claiming the market is finally stabilising. Rental supply is at its highest point in years. More properties are hitting the market than we've seen since the pandemic, and somehow tenants are worse off than ever before. This doesn't make sense, does it? How can there be more available properties but less affordability? How can the market be stabilising while working families are being priced out of their homes? The truth is, what's happening right now is far more complex and frankly more concerning than the headlines suggest. The rental market isn't just changing, it's being completely reshaped. And what's coming in the next 12 months could push hundreds of thousands of people into housing insecurity. We're talking about a transformation that affects every single person in this country, whether you're a tenant desperately trying to keep a roof over your head, a landlord trying to make sense of incoming legislation, or someone just watching house prices from the sidelines, wondering if you'll ever be able to afford your own place. Before we dive into the shocking details, if you want to stay ahead of what's really happening in the UK property market, smash that like button right now. Seriously, it helps more people see this crucial information, and with everything changing so rapidly, people need to know what's coming. And make sure you're subscribed to Property Reporter because we cut through the noise and bring you the real data, the actual numbers, and the honest analysis you need to make informed decisions about your housing future. We've just been covering some massive developments in UK property and housing, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Let's start with the numbers that everyone's talking about, but nobody's really explaining. The average rent across the UK has now hit £1,354 per month. That's £70 more than this time last year, which works out to a 5.5% increase. Now, you might think that sounds fairly modest compared to the chaos we saw a couple years ago, and you'd be partially right. The rate of increase has slowed down compared to 2021 and 2022 when rents were absolutely skyrocketing. But here's what those percentage points actually mean for real people. That's an extra £840 a year that tenants need to find. And for families already stretched thin by the cost of living crisis, that's not pocket change. That's a family holiday, that's emergency savings, that's the buffer that keeps you from falling into real financial trouble. But the national average only tells part of the story, because the regional differences are absolutely wild right now. The North East is experiencing the most dramatic rental inflation in the entire country, with rents climbing 9.1% year on year. This is the region that's traditionally been the most affordable place to rent in the UK, and it's now seeing the fastest price growth. Meanwhile, Yorkshire and the Humber is at the opposite end, with the slowest growth at just 3.8% annually. London, which everyone assumes is always the worst, is sitting at an eye-watering average of £1,960 a month. But its growth rate has actually been slowing for 9 consecutive months now, coming in at 5.3%. This tells us something crucial. The rental crisis isn't uniform across the country. It's hitting different regions in completely different ways, and understanding where the pressure points are matters if you're trying to figure out what comes next. Then, you've got these specific towns and cities that are seeing absolutely bonkers increases that make the regional averages look tame. Chippenham in Wiltshire has seen rents jump 16.4% in a single year. Stockport is up 16.1%. Coventry has climbed 14.1%. Even places like Grimsby, which you'd never think of as a rental hotspot, is up 12%. These aren't just statistics. These are places where actual families are getting renewal notices and having to choose between paying the increase or moving their kids to a different school, changing their entire lives because the financial pressure is just too much. Some landlords in these areas are clearly pushing rents as high as the market will bear, testing what tenants can actually afford before they break. Now, here's where things get really interesting. And this is the part that doesn't make sense until you dig deeper. Rental supply across the UK has increased by nearly 20% compared to last year. 20%. That's massive. We're seeing more properties available to rent than we've had in years. At the same time, letting agents are reporting that they're getting 24% fewer inquiries from prospective tenants compared to 12 months ago. Demand is dropping. Supply is rising. In any normal market, that should mean rents are falling or, at the very least, staying flat. But they're not. They're still going up. So what's actually going on here? The answer lies in understanding where this new supply is coming from and where the reduced demand is going. Buy-to-let mortgage approvals for property purchases jumped 60% in the first quarter of 2025. Landlords and property investors are coming back to the market after years of sitting on the sidelines. They saw rental yields hit 6% on average across the UK, with some areas like the North East and Scotland pushing above 7.5%, and suddenly being a landlord looked attractive again. Mortgage rates have stabilised after the chaos of recent years, and investors are feeling confident enough to jump back in. That's your supply increase right there. But the demand decrease is equally important. More people are managing to become first-time buyers because mortgage availability has improved slightly. They're leaving the rental market altogether, which reduces competition for rental properties. Migration levels have also fallen from their recent peaks, which means fewer new people entering the UK and needing somewhere to live immediately. But here's the crucial point that explains why rents are still rising despite these changes. Nearly 3/4 of landlords are reporting 0% vacancy rates. 0. Their properties are fully occupied. Yes, there are more properties available on the market at any given moment, but they're still getting snapped up quickly. The fundamental problem hasn't changed. There still aren't enough homes, period. And while supply has increased by 20%, that's 20% of a number that was already far too low. We're not building enough. We haven't been building enough for decades. And all these market adjustments are just shuffling around the edges of a much bigger structural crisis. Let's talk about what this actually means for the people living through it, because the affordability situation is genuinely frightening. Since 2020, rents have increased by 36%. House prices, which everyone focuses on, have only gone up about 20% in the same period. Wages have increased by roughly 31%. Do the math on that. Rents are rising faster than both house prices and wages. The gap between what people earn and what they pay to keep a roof over their heads is getting wider, not narrower. Renters are now spending 44% of their take-home pay on rent, up from 40% in 2020. Nearly half of what you earn goes straight to your landlord before you've bought food, paid for transport, covered energy bills, or saved a single penny for the future. The dream of home ownership has become almost laughable for most renters. Only 10% of renters aged 20 to 44 can afford to buy a home in the current market. 10%. And if you're a single renter in that age bracket, your chances drop to under 3%. 3 out of every 100 single renters in their 20s and 30s can afford to buy. For everyone else, renting isn't a choice or a lifestyle preference, it's a trap. You're stuck paying someone else's mortgage with no prospect of ever having your own, watching house prices climb further and further out of reach while your rent keeps going up. Over half of people who do manage to buy now need financial help from family. The so-called bank of mum and dad is propping up the entire first-time buyer market. If you don't have parents with money, you're at a massive disadvantage. The social housing situation is even bleaker. Over 1.3 million households in England are currently on waiting lists for social housing. That includes 336,000 households in London alone, and that number has increased by 10% in just the past 2 years. There are 123,000 households currently in temporary accommodation, including 160,000 children. Kids growing up in unstable, often unsuitable temporary housing, because their families have nowhere else to go. This temporary accommodation costs the government approximately £2 billion every year, money that's being spent on emergency measures rather than solving the underlying problem. And only 9,535 new social homes were built in 2022 to 2023. That's down from over 22,000 in 2003 to 2004. We're going backwards. Every year, more social homes are lost through right-to-buy sales or demolition due to poor conditions than are being added to the system. Now, if you thought all of that sounded bad, everything is about to get significantly worse, and the catalyst is a piece of legislation that just became law. The Renters' Rights Bill received royal assent on October 27, 2025, meaning it's now officially the Renters' Rights Act. Implementation is expected sometime between spring and autumn of 2026, though the government hasn't confirmed the exact date yet. They've promised to give landlords and letting agents sufficient time to prepare for what they're calling the biggest overhaul of the private rental sector in over 30 years. So what does this act actually do? The headline change is the abolition of Section 21 evictions, known as no-fault evictions. Under the current system, a landlord can serve a Section 21 notice and force a tenant to leave without giving any reason whatsoever. It's one of the leading causes of homelessness in the UK because tenants have almost no protection. You could be a model tenant, paying rent on time, keeping the property in perfect condition, and your landlord can still kick you out with just 2 months' notice simply because they feel like it. The new Act removes that power entirely. Landlords will now have to use Section 8 notices, which require them to specify valid legal grounds for eviction. Things like significant rent arrears, antisocial behaviour, or if they genuinely need to sell the property or move in themselves. For tenants, this is huge. It means you can actually challenge poor living conditions or unfair treatment without the constant fear that your landlord will retaliate by evicting you. The Act also abolishes fixed-term tenancies entirely. Every tenancy will become periodic, which means rolling month to month with no end date. Tenants will have a protected period of 12 months where landlords can't evict them to sell or move in, though tenants can still leave during that time by giving 2 months' notice. After 12 months, if a landlord wants their property back to sell or occupy, they'll need to give 4 months' notice. Rent increases will be limited to once per year and can only be done through a Section 13 notice. And if a tenant thinks the increase is excessive and above market rates, they can challenge it at a tribunal. The Act also bans rental bidding wars, where landlords and agents encourage prospective tenants to offer more than the asking rent to secure a property. It makes it illegal to discriminate against tenants who have children or who receive benefits. It gives tenants more rights to request pets in rental properties, and it applies the Decent Homes standard, which currently only exists for social housing, to the private rental sector, meaning properties will need to meet minimum standards for insulation, repair, and modern facilities. For tenants, especially those who've experienced the insecurity and fear of Section 21, this Act sounds like a massive win, and in many ways it is. These protections are long overdue. But there's another side to this story that's going to create serious consequences in the short term. 66% of landlords say they believe it will be harder to regain possession of their properties without Section 21. And even though 71% say they've never actually used a Section 21 eviction, many view it as a vital safety net. It's the nuclear option that makes them feel secure about renting out their property in the first place. Take that away, and a lot of landlords are re-evaluating whether they want to be landlords at all. The reports coming in from property professionals and online forums are concerning. Hundreds, possibly thousands of landlords are issuing final Section 21 notices right now, before Christmas, to get their properties back before the Act comes into force. These landlords aren't planning to find new tenants. They're planning to sell. They're exiting the market entirely. For the tenants receiving those notices, this is devastating. You're being forced out of your home through no fault of your own, right before Christmas, at a time when rental properties are scarce and competition is fierce. Many will struggle to find anywhere suitable. Some will end up in temporary accommodation. Others will be forced to move in with family or leave the area entirely. And when those properties are sold, they're not staying in the rental market. They're becoming owner-occupied homes, which shrinks the pool of available rental properties even further. This brings us to a bigger problem that's been building for years. 30% of landlords have already quit the market entirely. 50% of landlords surveyed by HMRC say they're considering leaving. The private rental sector hasn't grown since 2016. It's actually shrunk back to the size it was nearly a decade ago. And now we're adding a major legislative change that, while beneficial for tenant rights, is going to accelerate this exodus in the short term. Why are landlords leaving? The Renters' Rights Act is one pressure, but it's far from the only one. There's ongoing debate about energy performance certificate requirements, with proposals that all rental properties must reach EPC Level C by 2028. Bringing older properties up to that standard is expensive, sometimes prohibitively so, and many landlords are deciding it's not worth the investment. Landlords who are staying in the game are facing enormous costs for building safety remediation following the Grenfell disaster, dealing with damp and mould issues, and upgrading existing housing stock to meet new regulations. Over £50 billion is expected to be invested in existing social and rental housing stock over the next 5 years, which represents 43% of social housing turnover. That's money going into maintaining and upgrading what already exists, rather than building new homes. And in April of this year, Awab's law was implemented for social housing, requiring landlords to repair dangerous hazards like damp and mould within specific timeframes. It's expected to extend to private rentals as part of the Decent Home Standard under the new Act, which means more costs, more compliance requirements, and more risk for landlords. The result of all these pressures is a prediction that many experts are making with increasing confidence. The private rental sector could shrink drastically in 2026. Not slightly, drastically. We're potentially talking about tens of thousands of properties leaving the rental market in a single year. And that creates the perfect storm. Because while supply is contracting, demand isn't going anywhere. The UK population is ageing rapidly. The proportion of people aged 65 and over is expected to increase by 50% by 2039. These older people aren't just staying in their homes, they're often living in larger properties that families desperately need. But there's enormous political and social resistance to any policy that would encourage or force downsizing. The UK needs 300,000 new homes built every year just to keep pace with demand and start making a dent in the existing shortage. We're currently building around 230,000. That's a shortfall of 70,000 homes every single year, and it's been that way for over a decade. Compared to similar European countries, the UK has a backlog of 4.3 million missing homes that were simply never built. 4.3 million. That's not a number you solve quickly. The planning system is a nightmare of delays and rejections. We're seeing the fewest number of planning approvals in over a decade. Developments that should be straightforward get stuck in bureaucratic hell for years. And by the time approval comes through, economic conditions have changed and developers can't make the numbers work anymore. The construction industry is also facing a massive labour shortage. We need at least 225,000 additional workers by 2027 to meet even current demand, let alone the increased building rates we actually need. Brexit reduced the available workforce. An ageing demographic means fewer young people entering trades, and the pay and conditions in construction aren't attractive enough to pull people in from other sectors. So you've got demand that's structurally locked in and growing, and supply that's both insufficient and actively shrinking in the rental market. What happens next is predictable and ugly. Rents are going to continue rising, and probably faster than they did this year. Current predictions suggest we could see rent increases of between 5 and 10% in 2026, which is significantly higher than the 2.4 to 5.5% we've seen this year. That's on top of the 36% increase since 2020. For a tenant paying the UK average of £1,354 a month, a 10% increase means finding another £135 a month, or over £1,600 a year. Where's that money supposed to come from? Homelessness is already up 8% this year, and that was before the mass Section 21 evictions that are likely coming before Christmas and before the full impact of the Renters' Rights Act plays out. London boroughs are reporting a £330 million overspend on homelessness services. They're legally required to provide temporary accommodation to qualifying households, but the costs are spiralling out of control. The gap between what councils spend on temporary accommodation and what they receive back from government housing benefit subsidies hit £140 million in 2024 to 25, up 45% from the year before. If these trends continue, more boroughs are going to need emergency financial support from central government. Some may even issue Section 114 notices, which are essentially declarations of bankruptcy. Councils going bankrupt because they can't afford to house homeless residents is a shocking indictment of how broken the system has become. The social housing sector can't absorb the overflow either. They're already overwhelmed with over 1 million households on waiting lists, and they're building fewer new homes than they were 20 years ago. Temporary accommodation is stretched to breaking point. Private landlords are leaving. Social housing can't expand fast enough, and people still need somewhere to live. The only way this ends is with more people falling through the cracks into genuine housing insecurity. But here's something interesting, and it's a small ray of hope in an otherwise pretty bleak picture. Liverpool has been trying something different, and it's actually working. Instead of creating an adversarial relationship with landlords, Liverpool City Council is actively supporting them. They offer grants of up to £10,000 to landlords who will renovate properties that aren't currently suitable for letting and then lease them to the council as social housing for a guaranteed 5-year period. £10,000 can cover a new kitchen, a bathroom, carpets, and decent decorating. It brings an empty or substandard property back into productive use. The landlord gets a guaranteed income stream with no voids and no problem tenants because the council manages everything. The council gets social housing without the upfront cost of buying land and building from scratch, and families get taken out of expensive temporary accommodation and placed in stable, decent homes. This model works because it recognises that landlords aren't the enemy. Most landlords are ordinary people with 1 or 2 properties trying to make a reasonable return on their investment. They're not mega corporations or slum landlords, though those exist and absolutely should be dealt with harshly. But penalising all landlords with regulation after regulation, cost after cost, and making it harder and riskier to rent property doesn't solve anything. It just drives more of them out of the market. Liverpool's approach says, let's work together. Let's make it attractive for you to provide housing, and let's ensure that housing meets proper standards. It's a collaboration rather than a confrontation. The problem is, almost no other local authority in the country is following Liverpool's lead. Most councils are broke and can't afford to set up grant schemes. Central government hasn't created a national framework to encourage this kind of cooperation. And so, we're stuck in a system where landlords feel attacked and unsupported, tenants feel exploited and insecure, and councils are caught in the middle with no money and mounting responsibilities. So where does this leave us? We're heading into 2026 with a rental market that's being fundamentally reshaped. Supply has increased from record lows, but it's still nowhere near enough, and it's concentrated in the wrong places. The Renters' Rights Act is going to give tenants crucial protections that they absolutely need, But in the short term, it's likely to push more landlords out of the market before new landlords feel confident enough to enter under the new rules. Rents are going to keep rising because demand continues to outstrip supply, and landlords who stay in the market will need to cover increased costs and risks. Affordability is going to get worse before it gets better. More people are going to find themselves unable to save for a deposit while renting, unable to rent because they can't afford it, and unable to access social housing because the waiting lists are too long. Homelessness is going to increase. Councils are going to face even more financial pressure. And all of this is happening while we're still not building anywhere close to the number of homes we actually need. This isn't just a housing issue, it's an economic issue. When people spend nearly half their income on rent, they can't spend money on anything else. Businesses suffer. The economy stagnates. It's a social issue. Housing insecurity affects children's education, people's mental and physical health, and overall life outcomes. It's an intergenerational issue. Young people can't afford to move out, start families, or build independent lives. Middle-aged people, who should be in their peak earning years, are still renting with no prospect of ever owning. And older people are sitting in homes that are too large for their needs because there's nowhere suitable and affordable to downsize to. The solutions exist, but they require political will and long-term thinking that goes beyond one election cycle. We need massive planning reform to make it easier and faster to build homes where people actually want to live. We need investment in training the construction workers who will build those homes. We need a proper industrial strategy for housing that treats it as critical national infrastructure rather than something the market will magically sort out. We need to recognise that the private rental sector is a crucial part of the housing ecosystem and find ways to encourage responsible landlords while cracking down hard on rogues. We need councils to have the funding and powers to build social housing at scale again. And we need to accept that this is going to cost money up front, but the cost of not doing it is far higher in the long run. For tenants watching this, the advice right now is to build and maintain a good relationship with your landlord if you have one who's reasonable. Pay rent on time if you possibly can. Report maintenance issues clearly and in writing. Be a good tenant, because landlords who are on the fence about staying in the market are more likely to keep properties with reliable tenants who don't cause problems. Understand your rights under the new Act, especially around challenging unfair rent increases and knowing the proper grounds for eviction. And start thinking about your options now rather than waiting for a crisis. If your landlord hints they might sell, don't bury your head in the sand. Start looking at what else is available and what you can afford. For landlords, the message is equally important. Get educated about the Renters' Rights Act now. Don't wait until it comes into force and you're scrambling to understand what you're allowed to do. Make sure your properties meet the standards that are coming, particularly around the Decent Homes Standard. Budget for compliance costs rather than being caught off guard. And think seriously about whether you're in this for the long term. If you're not, it might be better to exit on your own terms rather than being forced out later. But if you are committed to being a landlord, recognise that the new system is designed to protect tenants from the worst practices that have plagued the sector. Good landlords who treat tenants fairly have nothing to fear from these changes. The rental market isn't improving, it's transforming. And the next 12 months are going to be turbulent. More people are going to struggle. More landlords are going to leave. More pressure is going to fall on councils and the social housing sector. But eventually, if the right policy decisions are made, if enough homes get built, if landlords and tenants can find a way to work within the new framework, we might come out the other side with a rental sector that's more secure, more affordable, and more functional than what we have now. That's a big if though. Make sure you've hit that like button if you found this information valuable. These deep dives into what's really happening in UK property take a lot of research, and your support helps us keep bringing you this level of detailed analysis. And if you're not already subscribed to Property Reporter, do it now. We're tracking every development in the UK housing and property market, breaking down the complex data and giving you the real story behind the headlines. Whether you're a tenant, a landlord, a first-time buyer, or someone just trying to understand what's happening to UK housing, we've got you covered with regular updates and in-depth analysis. The question facing the UK right now isn't whether the rental market will change. That's already happening. The real question is whether anyone will be able to afford what comes next. And that's something we'll all be finding out together over the coming year. Stay informed, stay prepared, and we'll keep bringing you the facts you need to navigate whatever comes next. 21 years ago, a warning was issued. The Barker Review painted a grim picture of Britain's housing future, highlighting inadequate supply, volatile prices, and growing unaffordability. Fast forward to 2025, and the prophecy has come true in the worst possible way. In fact, the situation has deteriorated so dramatically that London's construction industry has effectively ground to a halt. Out of 1,400 development sites across the capital, only 16 have actually broken ground. The government has been forced to declare what can only be described as a housing emergency, announcing radical interventions just last month to prevent a complete collapse. This isn't just a crisis anymore. It's a catastrophe that's reshaping British society, dividing generations, and locking millions out of home ownership forever. If you're watching this, you're probably feeling the squeeze yourself or know someone who is. The statistics are brutal, but they tell a story that affects real people making impossible choices every single day. So if you want to stay informed about the latest UK property and housing news that actually impacts your life, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Property Reporter. We cut through the noise and bring you the facts that matter. Now, let's dig into exactly how bad things have gotten. At the heart of this crisis sits a simple but devastating problem: affordability. The average home in England now costs £290,000. Sounds high, right? But here's where it gets truly alarming. The average household earns just £37,000 a year. Do the maths, and you're looking at a ratio of 7.7. That means the typical home costs nearly 8 times what a household earns annually. For most people, buying a home now requires one of 3 things: significant family wealth, dangerous levels of borrowing, or spending years, sometimes decades, saving for a deposit while watching prices climb even further out of reach. The consequences are playing out in real time. Home ownership rates have cratered from 74% to 65% in recent years. Only the richest 10% of the population can afford to buy a home on 5 years of salary. Think about that for a moment. 90% of people are effectively priced out unless they have exceptional circumstances or help. And if you're renting, you're already spending a third of your income on housing, with rents surging by nearly 9% annually. The system isn't just broken, it's actively widening inequality and threatening to split society into 2 distinct classes: those who own property and those who never will. Some people point to the past year showing marginal improvements in affordability, but this barely scratches the surface of the long-term disaster. Affordability today is worse than it was in 2004, and more than twice as bad as the 1970s. The data paints a picture of a market that has fundamentally disconnected from wage growth, leaving an entire generation stranded. But the crisis runs even deeper than numbers suggest. There's now a stark divide emerging in British society, one that's being driven by what's euphemistically called the bank of mum and dad. Over half of first-time buyers now rely on financial help from family to get on the property ladder. The statistics reveal a troubling pattern. Young buyers receiving parental assistance purchase homes at an average age of just over 30, with household incomes around £56,000. Those going it alone? They're typically over 32 years old, with higher incomes of £65,000. Yet here's the twist. Despite earning less, assisted buyers are purchasing more expensive properties thanks to significantly larger deposits. The numbers are staggering. The average deposit with family help sits at £118,000, and £73 compared to just £60,741 for those saving independently. Over the past 4 years, the Bank of Mum and Dad has provided £38.5 billion in assistance, a jaw-dropping 71% increase from the previous 4-year period. This isn't just helpful parents giving their kids a leg up. It's become a fundamental pillar holding up the entire housing market, and it's creating what experts are now calling an inheritocracy. What does that mean? Simple. Access to property is increasingly determined not by your skills, education, or hard work, but by whether your parents own property and have equity to share. If you're born into a family with housing wealth, you can access home ownership in your early 30s. If you're not, you might be waiting until your 40s, 50s, or inheriting property in your 60s, if at all. Recent research even found that stamp duty holidays disproportionately benefited those who could access the Bank of Mum and Dad, with parents extracting equity from their own homes to help their children. This isn't a housing market anymore. It's a mechanism for entrenching generational wealth divides and creating a permanent underclass locked out of property ownership. And then there's the elephant in the room nobody wants to talk about: the massive regional divide tearing the country apart. Not all of Britain is experiencing the same crisis. In Wales and Northern Ireland, homes remain relatively affordable. Northern towns like Burnley and Blackpool have affordability ratios of just 3.9, meaning a house costs less than 4 times the average salary. Compare that to Kensington and Chelsea, where the ratio explodes to 27.1. 27 times annual income for a home. It's almost incomprehensible. London and the South East have become the epicentres of this crisis, but the problem creates a vicious cycle that's strangling opportunity. The areas with the strongest job markets, the best career prospects, and the highest wages are precisely the places where housing is least affordable. Young graduates and professionals face an impossible choice: move to London and spend £2,000 a month on rent while struggling to save anything, or stay in an affordable area and watch your career prospects evaporate. This regional imbalance points toward a potential solution that few politicians want to seriously discuss. If the economy could be genuinely rebalanced, directing high-quality jobs and investment to regions where housing remains affordable, pressure might ease. At the same time, building significantly more homes in high-growth areas could reduce the bottlenecks pushing prices into the stratosphere. But that requires political will, long-term thinking, and coordination between local and national government. And right now, those things are in desperately short supply. If you think that sounds bad, wait until you hear what's happening in London. The capital's housing construction has suffered what can only be described as a catastrophic collapse. In the first quarter of 2025, just 347 affordable homes were started. By the second quarter, new starts had plummeted by 59%. Across more than a third of London's boroughs, there were 0 construction starts on major developments. 0. Out of 1,400 development sites across London, only 16 have actually begun building. The city is on track to deliver less than 5% of its annual target of 88,000 homes, by far the worst performance in 2 decades. Housing starts have fallen by more than 90% compared to just 2 years ago. Sales have collapsed to crisis levels, with only 5,933 new homes sold in the first 9 months of 2025. That's a fraction of the 22,000 per quarter needed to meet targets. At price points below £600 per square foot, where most Londoners actually buy, sales to individual owner-occupiers have been described as virtually non-existent. Industry insiders are now calling London a no-go zone for housing investment. The market hasn't just cooled, it's frozen solid. The implications are terrifying. Without new supply, London's rental market will be severely undersupplied after 2027, likely sending rents soaring even higher. Homelessness will worsen. Young workers will be pushed further out into commuter zones or simply leave the city altogether. The capital's economic productivity could suffer as businesses struggle to attract and retain talent who can't afford to live anywhere near their workplace. This isn't just a housing problem anymore. it's a threat to London's status as a global city. But why can't builders just build more homes? The answer might shock you. There are 7 major barriers strangling supply, and they're all getting worse. First, the loss of social housing. Since the 1980s, around 1.7 million council homes have been sold off through right to buy, with virtually no replacements built. That stock has never been recovered, leaving a massive hole in affordable housing provision that the private sector was never designed to fill. Second, private construction firms are profit-driven businesses. They have little incentive to build rapidly when slowly releasing homes onto the market sustains higher prices and bigger margins. Many developers prefer to sit on land with planning permissions, waiting for market conditions to maximise returns rather than actually solving the housing shortage. More than 280,000 homes across London have planning permission but remain unbuilt. These ghost sites represent thousands of families who could have homes, but don't, because it's more profitable to wait. Third, the cost of building itself has skyrocketed. Since 2000, the building cost index has surged by 140%, far outpacing general inflation. Estimates suggest constructing a 3-bed house in the UK can cost anywhere between £240,000 and £363,000. London has been ranked the second most expensive city in the world for construction. When building costs are that high, margins get squeezed and projects that might have been viable become impossible. Fourth, regulatory requirements have multiplied. New building safety regulations, while necessary, after tragedies like Grenfell, have added layers of bureaucracy and delay. The building safety regulators' processes have held up nearly 10,000 homes for more than 6 months in London alone. Dual staircase requirements, carbon offset charges, and various levies have pushed costs even higher, rendering many apartment-led schemes completely unviable. Fifth, local councils can block or delay projects even when developers want to proceed. The NIMBY reality in the UK is powerful and persistent. Residents understandably don't want their neighbourhoods transformed, creating political pressure on councillors to reject development. Planning approvals in London have plummeted to their lowest level since 2006, with just 966 projects approved in the year to June 2025. Sixth, the UK population has increased faster than expected, adding 8.1 million people since 2004. 6 million of that increase came from net migration. More people means more households needing homes, but the supply response has been nowhere near adequate to meet that demand. Seventh, the housing sector still uses largely the same labour-intensive methods as the Victorians did over a century ago. There's been remarkably little innovation or industrialisation compared to other sectors. Modular housing, factory-built components, and modern construction techniques remain relatively rare. When they are tried, results have been mixed, with several high-profile firms collapsing. The industry remains stuck in old patterns even as demand explodes. The real victims of this crisis aren't who you think. Beyond the statistics and policy debates, real human costs are mounting every single day. Young people are living at home with their parents for far longer than previous generations, not by choice, but by necessity. This delays family formation, impacts mental health, and strains family relationships. Parents who expected empty nests in their 50s find themselves still housing adult children well into their 30s. The collapse in the UK's fertility rate mirrors global trends, but housing costs are undeniably a significant factor. If you can't afford to buy or even rent a family-sized home, you delay having children. If you do settle down but face the cost difference between a 2-bed and 4-bed home, economic pressure pushes towards smaller families. These aren't abstract policy concerns. They're life decisions being shaped by a broken housing system. Meanwhile, an odd paradox persists. Over 72% of households in England have at least 2 bedrooms more than they actually need. This under-occupation typically involves older single people or couples in large family homes who find it difficult, expensive, and stressful to downsize. Higher stamp duty discourages people from moving, creating inefficiency in the market. The UK's home buying process is notoriously archaic, time-consuming, and one of the worst in the developed world. The average transaction takes over 6 months compared to just 69 days in the United States. This friction keeps people trapped in unsuitable properties, even when they might want to move. For those stuck in the private rental sector, conditions are often grim. 8% of private rentals are overcrowded, lacking sufficient bedrooms to avoid cramped living conditions. Rents have risen relentlessly, yet landlords are increasingly pulling out of the sector, often citing regulatory burdens and tax changes. There's a shift toward larger corporate landlords, but the fundamental problem remains. The sector hasn't kept pace with surging demand, creating intense price pressure that shows no signs of easing. And just when you thought it couldn't get worse, the homelessness crisis has exploded into a full-blown emergency. 1 in 50 Londoners is now homeless and living in temporary accommodation. That's not rough sleeping statistics. That's people in emergency B&Bs, hostels and unsuitable temporary housing. Across London, 336,366 people sit on council waiting lists for social housing, many waiting years with little hope of ever reaching the top of the list. Local councils collectively spent £2.8 billion on temporary accommodation in recent years, a staggering 180% increase over just 5 years. Of that, £844 million went to emergency B&Bs and hotels. Think about how inefficient that is. That money could have built permanent social housing, creating long-term solutions, and even generating rental income for councils. Instead, it's being burned on emergency crisis management, lining the pockets of hotel chains while failing to actually solve the problem for struggling families. The latest data shows rough sleeping itself continues to climb. The number of people forced to sleep on London's streets rose by 10% year on year, with those living on the streets long-term up 27%. Compared to a decade ago, rough sleeping has increased by 90%. These aren't just statistics. These are people, often with jobs, who simply cannot afford housing in one of the world's wealthiest cities. So is anyone actually doing anything about this? In October 2025, the government finally acknowledged the severity of the situation by announcing emergency measures for London. These aren't normal policy adjustments. They're desperate interventions to prevent complete market failure. The affordable housing requirement for new developments has been slashed from 35% to 20%, a controversial move aimed at making more projects financially viable for developers. The Mayor of London has been handed sweeping new powers to review and call in housing schemes of 50 homes or more, bypassing local planning objections. He can now act as the decision-maker on developments over 1,000 square metres on greenbelt land. The government is providing an initial £322 million to establish a City Hall Developer Investment Fund, with the aim of kick-starting stalled projects. Builders will receive time-limited emergency relief from the Community Infrastructure Levy where necessary to unlock development. These measures can fast-track the planning process by up to 6 months for qualifying schemes. The government insists this emergency package will unlock tens of thousands of homes across the capital. The target remains 1.5 million new homes by 2030, with London expected to deliver 440,000 of those. But here's the harsh reality. Experts warn these targets are impossible to achieve without far more radical intervention. To meet London's requirement of 88,000 homes annually, output would need to more than double, increasing by 175%. Current trends point in completely the opposite direction. Planning permissions are at their lowest level in nearly 2 decades. Construction starts have collapsed. Developer confidence has evaporated. Industry leaders describe the market as facing a perfect storm of high interest rates, soaring material costs, labour shortages, and regulatory complexity. Since 1997, house prices have quadrupled, while incomes have merely doubled. The UK now faces an estimated shortage of more than 4 million homes. Among advanced economies, Britain has the lowest ratio of housing stock relative to population and some of the most expensive housing. The disconnect between what people earn and what homes cost has reached levels that would have seemed impossible just a generation ago. The solutions exist, but they require political courage and long-term vision. greater use of modular housing and factory-built components could dramatically reduce costs and construction times. 3D printing technology for housing remains relatively unexplored but shows enormous potential. Some experts argue the crisis should be treated like a national emergency, similar to the post-war period when prefab housing was rapidly deployed to house families whose homes had been destroyed. Many of those supposedly temporary prefabs are still standing and occupied more than 60 years later. But innovation alone won't solve this. The UK also needs serious reform of the planning system, which remains Byzantine and inefficient. Local authorities need adequate funding and staffing to process applications quickly. The government needs to decide whether it's serious about building social housing directly or will continue the failed approach of subsidising private rents through housing benefit. Stamp duty needs reform to reduce friction in the market. The buying and selling process needs modernisation to match international standards. Most fundamentally, there needs to be an honest reckoning with the fact that housing cannot be simultaneously treated as an investment asset that perpetually increases in value and an affordable necessity that everyone can access. Those two goals are incompatible. For decades, governments of all parties have tried to square that circle, and the result is the disaster we're living through today. The housing crisis isn't just about bricks and mortar. It's reshaping British society in profound ways. It's determining who can have families and when. It's deciding which young people can pursue opportunities and which must compromise their ambitions for affordability. It's creating a two-tier system where wealth and opportunity are increasingly inherited rather than earned. It's pushing people into precarious living situations, damaging mental and physical health. It's draining billions from public budgets that could be invested in education, healthcare, or infrastructure. 21 years after the Barker Review warned this was coming, we're now living in the nightmare scenario it predicted. The question is whether we'll spend another 21 years watching things get worse, or finally summon the political will to treat this as the national crisis it truly is. The emergency measures announced last month are a start, but they're nowhere near sufficient. Without radical, sustained action, the UK housing market will continue to divide society, lock out generations, and undermine the country's economic future. The statistics are clear. The human costs are mounting. The solutions are known. What's missing is the courage to implement them. For now, millions of people remain trapped in a system that serves them poorly, watching their dreams of home ownership slip further away with each passing year. That's the state of UK housing in 2025, and unless something changes dramatically, it's only going to get worse. Right now, across Britain, hundreds of thousands of homeowners are sitting on their hands, not because they don't want to move, not because they can't afford to move, but because they're terrified of what's coming. 1 in 5 UK homeowners have completely paused their plans to sell. Another 38% of prospective buyers are lying awake at night worrying they won't be able to afford stamp duty on their next home. The British housing market hasn't just slowed down, it's essentially frozen, and everyone's waiting for the same thing. November 26th, 2025. That's when Chancellor Rachel Reeves will stand up and deliver the autumn budget. That's when we'll finally know what new taxes, what new rules, what new costs are about to hit the property market. But here's what nobody's talking about. While everyone's focused on what might be announced in a few weeks, a much bigger transformation is already underway. And it's changing who owns Britain forever. Before we dive deeper, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to Property Reporter so you never miss the latest UK property and housing news. We're tracking every development in this market, and trust me, you'll want to stay updated on what's coming next. So let's start with what already happened, because that's what's got everyone so spooked. Back in April 2025, stamp duty thresholds got slashed, absolutely hammered. If you're a first-time buyer, you now start paying stamp duty on any property over £300,000. That used to be £425,000. If you're a home mover, you're paying on anything over £125,000. That used to be £250,000. For the average buyer, That's an extra £2,500 straight out of their pocket. And if you remember March 2025, the panic was real. There were 177,000 property transactions that month. That's more than double the previous March. Everyone was racing to beat the deadline. Then April arrived. The higher thresholds kicked in, and the market didn't just slow down, it collapsed. Transactions dropped off a cliff. Buyer demand fell 8% compared to the previous year. But that April shock was just the beginning. Now the rumour mill is in absolute overdrive. Every week brings new speculation about what Rachel Reeves might announce on November 26th. And some of these rumours are genuinely terrifying if you own property. There's talk of replacing stamp duty altogether with an annual property tax on homes worth more than £500,000. Imagine that. Instead of paying once when you buy, you'd pay every single year just for owning your home. Then there's speculation about capital gains tax being applied to main homes above certain values. Currently, your primary residence is exempt from CGT when you sell. But rumours suggest properties worth more than £1.5 million could lose that protection. Landlords are hearing whispers about national insurance being charged on rental income, new council tax bans targeting expensive properties, particularly in London and the South East, spreading stamp duty payments over several years instead of one lump sum. And here's the thing, the Treasury keeps denying these rumours. They say nothing's been decided. They tell people not to make rash decisions based on speculation. But the damage is already done. Because in property, uncertainty is the real killer. When people don't know what's coming, they freeze. They wait. They hold off on the biggest financial decision of their lives. And that's exactly what's happening right now. While homeowners are frozen in fear, there's another group that's been moving fast. Landlords. And they're not just pausing, they're running for the exits. Last year, 19% of landlords sold properties. Only 8% bought new ones. Think about that ratio for a second. For every landlord buying, more than 2 are selling. In the first quarter of 2025, a staggering 15.6% of all properties listed for sale were ex-buy-to-lets. That's the highest rate in years. London's leading the charge. Nearly 1 in every 4 homes currently for sale in the capital used to be rental properties. So what's driving this mass exodus? The math simply doesn't work anymore. Mortgage rates have roughly doubled from their lows. Many landlords are seeing monthly payments that have tripled. Then came Section 24, the tax changes that stopped landlords from deducting mortgage interest from rental income before calculating tax. That alone wiped hundreds of pounds per month off profit margins. Stamp duty surcharge for additional properties jumped to 5% in April. Capital gains tax allowances got slashed, and CGT rates themselves are rising from April 2025, which pushed even more landlords to sell before the deadline hits. The autumn 2024 budget was the final straw for thousands of them. But there's something really interesting happening. Something that should concern every renter in Britain. Yes, small landlords are fleeing the market in droves, but corporate landlords, they're scaling up. Over 400,000 buy-to-let companies are now registered in the UK. That number has exploded by 332% since 2016. Last year alone, a record 61,517 new limited companies were set up to hold rental property. That's a 23% increase on what was already a record in 2023. Right now, 680,000 properties across England and Wales are held in corporate structures. And that number's growing by 70,000 to 100,000 every single year. Here's what's really happening. Your traditional landlord, the person with 1 or 2 flats, maybe a small portfolio, they're getting squeezed out by regulations and taxes. But big corporate players, they can absorb the costs. They have tax efficiency through corporate structures. They have economies of scale. They can weather short-term losses that would bankrupt individual landlords. So while the headlines scream about landlords leaving the market, the reality is more nuanced. Small landlords are exiting. Big corporate landlords are taking over. And if you think that doesn't matter, if you think a landlord's a landlord, let me tell you why you should care. Because we've seen this film before. After the 2008 financial crash in America, Wall Street firms swooped in and bought foreclosed homes by the thousand. Companies like Blackstone, Progress Residential, and Invitation Homes became major property owners almost overnight. And what happened to the tenants in those homes? Rent increases of 30 to 40% became common. Monthly junk fees appeared for things like administration, payment processing, and service charges. Repairs took forever because corporate landlords prioritised dividends over maintenance. Tenants had zero negotiating power. It was take it or leave it, because when one company owns the entire block, where else are you going to go? In some American cities today, 1 in 5 homes is owned by a corporate landlord. That's not a small business owner you can call when the boiler breaks. That's a faceless corporation where your home is line item number 4,387 in a spreadsheet. And that exact model is creeping into Britain right now. When housing stops being homes and becomes financial products, the people living in them stop being tenants and become revenue streams. Every corporate landlord has shareholders to answer to, and shareholders want one thing: maximum return on investment. Meanwhile, if you're actually trying to rent a home in Britain right now, you're experiencing a very different reality depending on where you live. Average UK rents jumped between 9% and 12% last year. Demand is absolutely ferocious. Each rental listing attracts an average of 10 applications. In some areas, it's more like 20 or 30. But here's where it gets strange. London rents actually fell by 2.8% over the past year. They've dropped back to May 2023 levels. Inner London saw rents decline 4.6%. So what's going on? Why are rents falling in the capital while skyrocketing everywhere else? Simple. Supply and demand actually working for once. London's got an oversupply of rental properties right now, particularly at the higher end. But step outside the capital, and it's a completely different story. The North East has seen rental prices surge by 11.9%, Yorkshire and Humber up 7.4%, North West up 6.9%. These aren't small increases. These are region-changing price shifts. And here's the real problem. When landlords sell their rental properties, who's buying them? 2 out of every 3 ex-rental homes are being bought by first-time buyers, not new landlords. Which means every sale removes a rental property from the market permanently. Rental housing supply is shrinking at exactly the moment demand is exploding. According to Oxford Economics, only 1 in 8 renters could actually afford to buy a home in the area where they currently live. So you've got millions of people who need to rent, fewer properties available to rent, and corporate landlords replacing individual ones. It's a perfect storm, and it's only getting worse. So back to November 26th, back to the budget that's got everyone paralysed. What's actually going to happen? Here's what we know. The government desperately needs to raise revenue. Public spending commitments are massive. The fiscal situation is tight. Property makes an easy target because wealth in bricks and mortar is visible. You can't hide a house offshore in the Cayman Islands. But Rachel Reeves is also trapped. Go too hard on property taxes and you risk tanking market confidence completely. You could trigger a cascade where even more landlords dump properties, rental supply collapses further, and rents spike higher. You could freeze the entire housing market for months, destroying transaction volumes and the stamp duty revenue that comes with them. You could hammer homeowners in London and the South East who are already stretched thin on affordability. But go too soft, and you don't raise the money you need. You face criticism for not taxing wealth properly. You miss your fiscal targets. It's a genuinely difficult position. History tells us that markets usually respond positively once clarity emerges. Even bad news is better than uncertainty. People can plan, They can make decisions. They can move forward. But that only works if the clarity isn't absolutely devastating. If the announced measures are too harsh, clarity won't help. It'll just confirm everyone's worst fears. But here's what bothers me. Everyone's obsessing over what gets announced on November 26th. The entire property market is holding its breath for one speech, one budget, one set of policies. And I get it. Those policies matter. They'll affect millions of people. They could cost or save individuals tens of thousands of pounds. But while we're all staring at the budget, mesmerised like rabbits in headlights, we're missing the bigger picture. This isn't really about one budget. It's about the direction Britain's been travelling for years. Home ownership in the UK peaked at over 70% in the early 2000s. Since then, it's been sliding backwards. Private renting has surged. More young adults are living with their parents than at any point in modern history. The average age of a first-time buyer keeps climbing. Property prices in relation to wages have become completely disconnected. We're watching Britain transform from a nation of homeowners back to something that looks remarkably like the 19th century. Back then, most land and property was owned by a tiny elite. Aristocrats, the crown, the church. Ordinary people rented. Full stop. Through the 20th century, that changed. The government built millions of homes. Wages rose faster than house prices. Home ownership soared from just 10% at the start of the century to over 70% by 2000. For one brief, shining moment, Britain was a nation where ordinary people could own their homes. But that peak is now reversing. Government house building collapsed. The private sector took over, and housing became financialised. Except this time, the tiny elite who own everything aren't aristocrats. They're pension funds, private equity firms, and corporate landlords. They're institutional investors who see British homes as assets in a global portfolio. 1 in 5 British homeowners are frozen right now, waiting to see what the Chancellor announces. Hundreds of thousands of people have put their lives on hold because they're scared of what's coming on November 26th. And those fears are completely justified. The changes could be significant, the costs could be substantial. But while everyone's focused on the budget, the real transformation keeps rolling forward. Small landlords are being replaced by corporate ones. Home ownership rates continue their long decline. An entire generation is being locked out of property ownership entirely. The rental sector is consolidating into fewer, bigger hands. Britain is becoming a nation of permanent renters, paying corporations for the basic human need of shelter. So yes, watch the budget on November 26th. Yes, pay attention to what Rachel Reeves announces. Those details matter. But don't lose sight of the bigger question. The question nobody in power seems willing to ask. In 10 years, will ordinary Britons own homes at all? Or will we have completed the circle back to the 19th century, where a tiny elite owns the land and everyone else pays rent forever? The budget might freeze the market for a few more weeks. These structural changes are reshaping Britain for decades, and the clock's already ticking. London, once the beating heart of a global empire, now home to a crisis that's tearing apart the fabric of one of the world's most iconic cities. More than 1 in 4 Londoners are living in poverty today. Homelessness is 8 times the national average, and while families are being pushed onto the streets, nearly half of all property purchases in central London are being snapped up by foreign buyers who'll never even live there. This isn't just a housing problem anymore. It's a complete system failure that's locked an entire generation out of home ownership. And the numbers behind it are absolutely staggering. Right now, the median household in Britain brings home just under £37,000 a year. Sounds reasonable until you look at what they're up against. The median house price sits at £270,000. That's more than 7 times their annual income. But here's where it gets worse. To even qualify for a mortgage, you can't be spending more than 30% of your income on housing. That's the stress threshold that banks use. Do the math on a typical mortgage with a 10% deposit at 7% interest, and you're looking at payments of over £20,000 a year. That's more than half of what the median household earns, which means banks simply won't lend to them. You need a bank to buy a house, but the bank won't let you buy a house. It's a trap with no exit. Before we go further, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to Property Reporter. We're bringing you the latest UK property and housing news that actually matters, cutting through the noise to show you what's really happening in the market. Don't miss out on the stories that affect your future. So how did Britain end up in this mess? The answer takes us back 4 decades to a decision that changed everything. Before 1980, house prices in the UK barely moved at all. And I mean barely. With inflation factored in, the house price index was at 47 in 1845. Over a century later, in 1960, it was still at 47. Prices were essentially flat for more than 100 years. At that rate, it would take 280 years for house prices to double. Then Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister and everything changed. Thatcher's government deregulated the finance sector in a massive way. Before her reforms, most home loans came from building societies. These institutions worked differently than banks. When a building society made a loan, money moved from their deposit accounts to the borrower's account. Simple transfer, no new money created. But banks operate on a completely different principle. When a bank makes a mortgage loan, it creates new money out of thin air. The bank's assets go up by the loan amount, and so do their liabilities in the form of new deposits. This expands the money supply, pumps more cash into the housing market, and drives prices through the roof. After Thatcher deregulated mortgage lending, banks took over from building societies as the main lenders, and that's when household debt absolutely exploded. Between 1980 and 2007, household debt increased by a factor of 4. It went from 20% of GDP to 80% of GDP. House prices followed the same trajectory, rising by 3% per year in real terms. At that new rate, prices were doubling every 23 years instead of every 280 years. The City of London made billions from this deregulation, but for average Britons, it was a disaster that keeps getting worse. The mechanism behind this is actually quite simple, but it creates a vicious cycle that's almost impossible to break. More mortgage debt pushes house prices up. Higher prices mean properties can be used as collateral for even bigger loans. Rising prices attract speculators who see houses as investments rather than homes. This drives even more demand, which pushes prices higher still, which encourages more debt. Round and round it goes. The cycle kept spinning faster and faster until it crashed the entire economy in 2008 during the global financial crisis. But even that crash didn't fix the underlying problem. Prices recovered, debt kept climbing, and now we're right back in crisis mode. Today's London tells the story better than any statistic ever could. Walk through central London and you'll see gleaming luxury flats with their lights off night after night. Ghost homes owned by overseas investors who bought them purely as assets. Meanwhile, 45% of all property purchases in the heart of the capital are made by foreign buyers. These aren't people looking for a place to live. They're parking money in London real estate because it's seen as a safe investment. And who can blame them when prices just keep going up? But this foreign investment tsunami has devastating consequences for locals. Every property bought by an international investor is one less home available for a British family. Prices get pushed even higher, further out of reach for ordinary workers. The human cost is written all over the city. Homelessness has skyrocketed to 8 times the national average. Families who've lived in London for generations are being forced out to cheaper areas, sometimes hours away from their jobs. Young professionals are resigning themselves to renting forever, watching their monthly payments disappear with nothing to show for it. The dream of home ownership has become exactly that for most people, just a dream, and the poverty rate keeps climbing. More than 1 in 4 Londoners now live below the poverty line. In one of the wealthiest cities on earth, a quarter of the population can't make ends meet. That's not a functional housing market, that's a broken system. But what if there was a way to fix this? What if we could reverse the damage done by decades of deregulated lending and foreign speculation? There are solutions out there, though they require political courage that's been in short supply. The first solution is called Property Income Limited Leverage, or PIL for short. Here's how it would work. Instead of letting banks lend whatever they want based on inflated house prices, mortgages would be limited to a multiple of the actual rental income a property could generate. Right now in London, house prices are roughly 25 times annual rental income. That's absurd. Under PIL, new mortgages would start at current ratios but then gradually decrease over time until they reached about 10-1. This would have a dramatic effect on the market. Houses would stop being attractive speculative investments because the leverage would be capped. You couldn't borrow massive amounts to gamble on ever-rising prices. Properties would return to being what they should be, homes for people to live in, not chips in a financial casino. Obviously, this would put downward pressure on house prices, which is exactly the point. For the millions of people currently locked out of home ownership, falling prices would be fantastic news. But for property-owning baby boomers sitting on paper fortunes, this would be political poison. And that's why PIL needs to be paired with a second solution. The second solution is the Affordable Housing Authority, or AHA. This is where things get really interesting. The AHA would provide upward pressure on house prices while simultaneously making it easier for low-income households to actually buy homes. Sounds contradictory, right? But here's the key. It would cut banks out of the equation entirely. Remember how banks are non-existent middlemen for median earners? They won't lend to people who can't afford sky-high interest payments. But what if there was a lender that didn't need to charge interest at all? Here's the math that changes everything. Take that median household earning £37,000 trying to buy a £270,000 house. With a 10% deposit and a 7% interest rate on a 25-year mortgage, they'd pay over £20,000 a year. That's more than half their income, so banks reject them. But remove the interest entirely, and the annual payment drops to just £9,300. That's 26% of their income, which falls below the stress threshold. Suddenly, home ownership becomes possible. So where would these zero-interest loans come from? The Affordable Housing Authority would be financed through government money creation. Not taxpayer money, not borrowed money, created money. The same way banks create money when they make loans. The difference is the AHA wouldn't need to charge interest because it's not trying to make a profit. It would lend to buyers earning median wage or below. Those buyers would use the funds to purchase homes. The money would go to the sellers. And then the buyers would repay just the principal over 25 years. No interest. No massive wealth transfer to banks who contribute nothing to the actual housing stock. Now, some people might call this socialist nonsense. But let me quote two famous capitalists who understood this principle a century ago. Henry Ford and Thomas Edison were campaigning for a massive hydroelectric project to be financed through government money creation rather than bank loans. Edison said the problem with bank financing was that for $30 million of their own money, the American people would be forced to pay $66 million when interest was included. He called it the terrible thing about interest. People who don't contribute any materials or do any work end up collecting more money than the people who actually build the project. The same logic applies to housing today. Banks don't build houses, they don't contribute materials, they just create money and charge interest on it. Meanwhile, they refuse to lend to the very people who need housing most. The beauty of combining PIL and AHA is that they balance each other out. PIL would reduce leverage and put downward pressure on prices by limiting speculation. AHA would increase demand from low-income buyers who are currently shut out, putting upward pressure on prices. Sellers who'd lose out from reduced bank lending would benefit from increased demand from AHA-financed buyers. Even banks, who don't currently earn anything from below-average earners they won't lend to anyway, would earn interest on AHA bonds issued to keep the system balanced. Everyone wins. But here's the problem. Britain's major political parties won't touch these ideas. Labour and the Conservatives have both been captured by the financial sector. They still believe in outdated economic theories that favour banks over people. They talk endlessly about government debt while ignoring the private debt that's actually crushing households. But smaller parties might see an opportunity here. The Greens, Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana's new party, George Galloway's Workers' Party. With more than half of Britain's voting age population now unable to buy a house, a platform built around Peel and AHA could be a massive electoral winner. It would give hope to millions who've been abandoned by the current system. The deeper issue that nobody wants to talk about is private debt itself. Politicians obsess over government debt figures, while private debt has ballooned to catastrophic levels. Household debt quadrupled as a share of GDP between 1980 and 2007. It crashed the economy once already, and it's climbing again. This private debt sits behind almost every social and economic problem Britain faces today. Young people can't start families because they can't afford homes. Workers can't save for retirement because rent swallows their income. Communities are being destroyed as long-term residents are priced out. And all of it traces back to the deregulation of mortgage lending and the explosion of private debt it created. The only real solution to excessive private debt is something called a modern debt jubilee. It's a way to reduce household debt without causing economic collapse. Ancient societies understood this principle. When debt became too burdensome, they'd declare a jubilee and wipe the slate clean. Modern economies need something similar, but designed for today's complex financial system. The idea is to create new money and use it to pay down private debts directly. This would reduce the debt burden on households while maintaining the money supply in the economy. It wouldn't cause the deflationary spiral that normally happens when everyone tries to pay off debt at once. A modern debt jubilee would face massive political resistance, of course. Banks would lose out on interest income. Wealthy people who don't need debt relief would complain about unfairness. But the alternative is worse. Without debt relief, the current system just keeps grinding forward, crushing more families under the weight of unaffordable housing and unpayable mortgages. At some point, the debt burden becomes so heavy that the economy collapses under its own weight. We saw it in 2008. We'll see it again if nothing changes. The question is whether politicians will find the courage to act before the next crisis hits. London's housing disaster didn't happen by accident. It's the direct result of policy choices made over the past 4 decades. Deregulating bank lending, allowing unlimited leverage on property purchases, permitting massive foreign investment without considering the impact on local residents. Each decision made sense to someone at the time, usually someone in the financial sector, but the cumulative effect has been devastating for ordinary people. A city that once offered opportunity to working-class families has become a playground for the global wealthy, with actual Londoners pushed to the margins. The solutions exist. Peel would limit speculation by capping leverage based on rental income. AHA would enable low-income buyers to purchase homes through zero-interest government loans. A modern debt jubilee would reduce the crushing burden of private debt. Together, these policies could reverse decades of damage and restore home ownership as a realistic goal for average earners. But implementation requires political will that's currently absent from Britain's major parties. Until voters demand change loudly enough, the crisis will only deepen. What's happening in London is a warning for other cities around the world. When finance is deregulated and property becomes a speculative asset rather than a basic need, ordinary people lose. They lose their homes, their communities, and their future prospects. The wealth gap widens. Poverty spreads even in the richest neighbourhoods. And eventually, the social fabric tears apart. Britain is living through this transformation right now. The question is whether it will find a way to reverse course before the damage becomes permanent. If you found this deep dive valuable, make sure you're subscribed to Property Reporter and hit the notification bell. We're committed to bringing you the real stories behind UK property and housing news, not just the headlines, but the analysis that helps you understand what's actually happening and why it matters. The housing crisis affects millions of families across Britain, and we're here to keep you informed every step of the way. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on these proposed solutions. Could Peel and AHA actually work? What would it take to make politicians listen? Let's keep this conversation going, because the more people understand these issues, the harder it becomes for those in power to ignore them. The fight for affordable housing is far from over, and your voice matters in shaping what comes next. While landlords are fleeing the market and headlines scream about an imminent crash, a small group of investors is quietly building wealth at a pace we haven't seen in years. They're not waiting for the perfect moment, they're not paralyzed by fear, and they're certainly not listening to the same tired advice that keeps most people stuck on the sidelines. The question everyone's asking right now is whether 2025 is the right time to buy property, or if you should sit tight and wait for conditions to improve. But here's what nobody's telling you. That question itself is the trap. Because while you're waiting for certainty, opportunity is slipping through your fingers at a rate that might shock you. In this video, we're going to expose the real cost of waiting, reveal a housing crisis that guarantees demand for decades, and show you exactly where the smart money is moving right now. But before we dive in, if you want to stay ahead of every major shift in the UK property and housing market, hit that like button and subscribe to Property Reporter. We bring you the latest news, data, and insights that could make or break your investment decisions. Right? Let's get into it. Here's the uncomfortable reality that most property gurus won't share with you. Every single year, people convince themselves that now isn't the right time. Interest rates are too high, prices are too inflated, a crash is coming, the headlines are too negative, there's always a reason to wait. And every year, those same people watch from the sidelines as prices creep higher, rents surge, and opportunities vanish. Let's talk about what waiting actually costs, because the numbers are brutal. Someone who didn't buy in 2012, thinking prices would fall further after the crash, has now missed out on well over 100 grand in capital growth. That's not even counting more than a decade of rental income that could have been covering their mortgage and building equity. Even people who paused during the uncertainty of 2020 and 2021 have missed roughly 50,000 in growth, plus one of the strongest rental markets in living memory. Think about that for a moment. 50,000 quid and years of rent, gone, because they were waiting for the perfect signal that never came. The myth of perfect timing has probably cost British investors more money than any crash ever could. Because here's the truth. The perfect time only reveals itself in hindsight. When conditions actually look perfect, when everyone's enthusiastic and prices are soaring, that's usually the worst possible moment to buy. And when it genuinely is a good time, when prices have corrected and opportunity is staring you in the face, it feels terrifying. The news is negative, banks are cautious, everyone thinks you're mad, so most people freeze. They wait for someone to tell them it's safe, and by the time it feels safe, they've already missed the window. But there's something even more important happening beneath the surface right now. Something that almost guarantees property will remain one of the strongest investments in Britain for decades to come. And it's a crisis that's been building for so long, most people have become numb to it. The UK is currently short 6.5 million homes compared to similar European countries. Let that sink in for a second. 6.5 million. That's not a temporary blip or a minor shortage. That's a structural crisis decades in the making. To put it in perspective, over 1.3 million households are sitting on waiting lists for social housing right now. Another 123,000 families are crammed into temporary accommodation, including 160,000 children. These aren't statistics. These are people who need homes and can't find them. The government keeps saying we need to build 340,000 new homes every year just to meet current demand. But we're not even close. Recent years have seen us build around 230,000 homes annually, and in some years we've barely cracked 200,000. We've been undershooting targets for so long that the backlog now sits at roughly 4.3 million homes. Even if immigration dropped to zero tomorrow, which obviously isn't happening, we'd still be 6.5 million homes short. The maths is simple and devastating. Demand is crushing supply, and it's going to stay that way for decades unless something dramatic changes. Which brings us to the investor's perspective. When demand massively outstrips supply for years on end, what happens to prices and rents? They go up. They keep going up, and they don't stop going up until either supply catches up or demand collapses. Neither is happening anytime soon. Now here's where things get interesting, and it's going to challenge what you've been hearing from the doom merchants. Everyone's been waiting for the next big crash, the housing market apocalypse that's supposedly right around the corner. Property prices are going to tank, foreclosures everywhere, blood in the streets. But what if I told you the crash already happened and you didn't even notice? Between mid-2022 and now, property prices have already fallen by around 15 to 20% in real terms. Not nominal prices, those have stayed relatively flat. But when you factor in inflation, which has been running hot, the real value of property has quietly dropped by a significant margin. This is what's called a silent correction. It does the same job as a dramatic crash, cooling the market and resetting prices, but it happens so gradually that it doesn't make headlines. Nobody panics. There are no emergency news bulletins, but the effect is the same. Right now, in late 2025, listings are up. Properties are taking longer to sell. Buyers suddenly have leverage again. These are not the signs of a market about to crash. These are the signs of a market that's already corrected and is now stabilizing. If we were truly heading into a bubble-bursting manic crash scenario, we'd be seeing the opposite. Prices would be skyrocketing. Buyers would be paying whatever it takes. Lending would be reckless. That's not what's happening. The market has cooled. It's found a new equilibrium. And while everyone's still waiting for the dramatic collapse, the smart investors are recognizing this for what it is, a window. So if the market's already corrected and the housing shortage isn't going anywhere, where exactly should you be looking? Because not all property is created equal, and not all regions offer the same returns. Let's talk about where the smart money is quietly moving right now. Manchester and Birmingham are absolutely printing money for investors who know what they're doing. Birmingham is projected to see rental values jump by over 22% between 2024 and 2028. Manchester's economic growth is outpacing the national average, and rental yields in both cities are comfortably sitting in the 6 to 7% range for standard buy-to-let properties. But here's where it gets even more interesting. If you're willing to go slightly more hands-on, houses in multiple occupation are delivering average yields of 8.4%. That's nearly double what you'd get from a typical single-let property in many parts of the country. The maths is simple. Renting out rooms individually to multiple tenants brings in significantly more than renting to one household. Yes, there's more management involved. Yes, there are stricter regulations. But for investors who can handle that, the returns speak for themselves. Then there's social housing, which almost nobody talks about, but might be one of the smartest plays available right now. With over 1 million households on waiting lists and local authorities desperate for accommodation. Social housing offers lease lengths of 10 to 25 years. Think about that. 25 years of guaranteed income with virtually zero void periods. No chasing tenants, no worrying about whether someone's going to renew. Housing associations typically handle all the management. It's about as close to passive income as property gets. And with the government pushing hard to increase social housing supply, the sector is only going to grow. Northern regions like the North East and Yorkshire are also worth a serious look. Properties in places like Sunderland start from around 56 grand, Bradford from about 59 grand. That's 2 to 3 times more property for your money compared to the south. And these aren't dead zones. They're cities with universities, regeneration projects, and genuine rental demand. The yields are strong, the entry costs are low, and the potential for growth is significant. But let's zoom out for a second and talk about why this housing crisis is actually getting worse, not better. And why that's simultaneously terrible for society, but potentially incredible for investors who position themselves correctly. Only 10% of renters aged 20 to 44 can currently afford to buy a home. Among single renters in that age group, the figure drops to less than 3%. 3%. That means 97% of single renters in their 20s, 30s, and early 40s are locked out of home ownership. They're not choosing to rent. They have no other option. More than half of first-time buyers now need financial help from family just to get on the ladder. The so-called bank of mum and dad has become essential, not optional. And for those without wealthy parents, the dream of ownership is slipping further away every year. House prices have risen at twice the rate of wages over the past 2 decades. The average deposit needed keeps climbing. The age of first-time buyers keeps creeping up. Young people are living with their parents longer, not because they want to, but because they can't afford to leave. This is a generation that will rent for life unless something fundamental changes. And nothing fundamental is changing. Which means one thing for property investors: demand for rental accommodation is going to remain absolutely sky-high for decades. Tenant demand in 2024 was nearly double what it was before the pandemic. The average rental property now attracts 19 inquiries, 19 people competing for one property, and rents have jumped by 8.7% year on year as of early 2025, with some regions seeing even steeper increases. This isn't a temporary spike, this is the new normal. The affordability crisis for buyers is the rental sector's growth engine, and that engine isn't slowing down anytime soon. Now, if you're thinking about making a move in the property market, the next 12 to 18 months might offer something we haven't seen in a while: a genuine window of opportunity with a ticking clock. Changes to stamp duty are coming into effect in April 2025, and that's going to influence buyer behaviour significantly. We've seen this before. When temporary nil-rate bans were introduced back in 2020, there was a massive surge in activity right before the deadline. Buyers rushed to complete before the window closed. We could see something similar play out again, which means the market might heat up faster than expected in certain price brackets. The government's also pushing hard on housing targets. Local authorities are now legally required to meet specific building quotas, and there's genuine political pressure to deliver on the promise of 1.5 million new homes over the next parliament. Whether they'll actually hit those targets is another question entirely, but the intent is there. Planning reforms are being fast-tracked, and there's talk of unlocking greenbelt land to ease the supply crunch. What does this mean for you? It means the current conditions, where prices have corrected, buyers have leverage, and sellers are being realistic, might not last. Once confidence returns and transaction volumes pick up, which forecasters expect to happen through 2026, the window starts closing. Mortgage lending is projected to jump by 16% in 2025 compared to 2024, driven by improving affordability and lower interest rates. More buyers mean more competition. More competition means prices start climbing again. Major forecasters are predicting that 2026 and beyond will see stronger growth, with some estimating 4 to 6% annual increases once the market fully stabilizes. If you wait for everything to feel comfortable and predictable, you'll be buying into that rising market, paying more for the same property you could have secured now. So let's bring this all together, because the real question isn't whether now is a good time to buy. The real question is, what's riskier, acting or waiting? Most people think risk means putting money into the market when things feel uncertain. But there's another kind of risk that nobody talks about: the risk of doing nothing. The risk of sitting on the sidelines while prices rise, rents surge, and opportunities disappear. That's not safety. That's guaranteed loss. The UK is facing a housing shortage so severe it will take decades to fix, even in the best-case scenario. Demand for rental properties is at historic highs and isn't going anywhere. The market has already corrected in real terms, and we're now in a stabilisation phase that offers genuine buying conditions. Meanwhile, changes to stamp duty, improving mortgage rates, and increasing transaction volumes mean the current window won't stay open forever. If you don't act in 2025, one of two things will happen by this time next year. Either the market picks up, prices rise, and you've missed the easier entry point, or the market stays flat and you're exactly where you are now, except you've lost 12 months of rental income and you're no closer to your goals. Either way, waiting doesn't protect you. It just delays progress. The investors who will look back on 2025 as a turning point aren't the ones with perfect timing or the biggest budgets. They're the ones who recognized that uncertainty is just another word for opportunity and had the nerve to act while everyone else was frozen in fear. So ask yourself this: a year from now, when you look back on this moment, will you wish you'd moved, or will you be glad you waited? House prices in the UK jumped nearly 5% last year. Interest rates hit their highest point in 15 years. So why didn't the market collapse like everyone predicted? The answer is going to shock you, and what's coming next could change everything for British homebuyers. Right now, the UK property market is caught in the middle of something unprecedented. Rates have been slashed twice since August, dropping from that peak of 5.25% down to 4%. Sounds like good news, right? But here's what the headlines aren't telling you. Mortgage rates are still sitting around 5% for most buyers, and millions of homeowners haven't felt the pain yet. They're still on old fixed deals from when rates were rock bottom. That's about to change. Before we dive deeper into this mess, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to Property Reporter. We're bringing you the latest UK property and housing news that actually matters, cutting through the noise to show you what's really happening in the market. Let's rewind to understand how we got here. Back in late 2021, you could get a mortgage for under 2%. The Bank of England's base rate was practically nothing. Then inflation exploded. Energy prices went through the roof. The cost of everything from bread to petrol skyrocketed. The Bank of England panicked and started hiking rates aggressively. Within 18 months, rates went from nearly 0 to 5.25%. It was one of the fastest rate hiking cycles in British history. Every economist, every property expert, every financial journalist made the same prediction. House prices were going to crash. Some forecasts showed falls of 10%, even 15%. Estate agents braced for disaster. Sellers held off listing their homes. The market was supposed to freeze, then collapse. Except that's not what happened. Prices barely flinched. They stumbled slightly in late 2022, dropped maybe 5% in some areas, then started climbing again. By the end of 2024, prices were higher than they'd been at the previous peak. The crash everyone predicted never came. But there's another storm brewing right now that nobody saw coming, and it's creating absolute chaos in the market. April 2025 marked a massive shift in stamp duty rules, and the deadline triggered a buying frenzy unlike anything we've seen in years. Here's what changed. Before April, first-time buyers paid zero stamp duty on properties up to £425,000. That threshold just dropped to £300,000. If you're buying a £400,000 home, you went from paying nothing in tax to paying £5,000 overnight. For regular buyers, the tax-free threshold dropped from £250,000 all the way back down to £125,000. That's an extra £2,500 in tax for anyone buying an average-priced home. March 2025 saw an absolute scramble. Buyers were desperately trying to complete purchases before the deadline. Estate agents were working around the clock. Solicitors were overwhelmed. Everyone wanted to beat the tax increase. Nationwide predicted exactly this would happen. They said we'd see a massive spike in March, then a corresponding slump for 6 months after. That's exactly what's playing out right now. The property market is experiencing whiplash. Sales are down. Buyers who missed the deadline are sitting on the sidelines, wondering if they should wait for prices to fall now that fewer people can afford to buy. So let's tackle the question everyone's been asking. Why didn't house prices crash when interest rates went up? The answer is complicated, but it comes down to 3 massive factors that most people completely missed. First, there's simply not enough housing. Britain has a chronic supply shortage. Successive governments have promised to build 300,000 homes per year. They've never hit that target. Not even close. When there aren't enough homes for the number of people who want to buy them, prices stay high no matter what happens with interest rates. It's basic economics, but it's the most important piece of the puzzle. Second, there's a huge group of people who aren't affected by interest rates at all. This is the part that shocked researchers. More than half of UK homeowners now own their property outright with no mortgage. That shift happened around 2023. These people accumulated massive savings during the pandemic when they couldn't spend money on holidays, restaurants, or entertainment. They're sitting on cash. When they want to buy a bigger house or a second property, they're not worried about mortgage rates. They're paying in cash or putting down enormous deposits. This group has kept the market alive. Third, the wealthy got significantly wealthier during and after the pandemic. This is the uncomfortable truth. While ordinary families struggled with the cost of living crisis, people with assets saw their wealth explode. They're buying property as investments. They're outbidding first-time buyers. They're turning homes into rental properties. Their demand for assets, including houses, has kept prices elevated even as affordability for regular people has collapsed. Here's where it gets really dark for anyone trying to get on the property ladder. The average UK house price is now sitting around £270,000, though in some areas it's already past £290,000. First-time buyers in most of the country need a deposit of at least £27,000 for a 10% deposit, and that's if they can even find something at that price. In London and the South East, you're looking at needing £50,000 or more just for the deposit. For someone earning the median UK salary of around £34,000, saving that deposit would take years, maybe a decade, and that's assuming house prices don't keep rising while they save. But they will keep rising. Meanwhile, rents have absolutely exploded. Private rents went up 9.1% in the last year alone. That's one of the biggest annual increases ever recorded. Young people are stuck paying record rents, which makes it nearly impossible to save for a deposit, which means they stay renting forever. Which means landlords can keep pushing rents higher because demand is insane. It's a vicious cycle, and there's no escape for millions of people. Here's something that's flying under the radar, but it's absolutely crucial. 3/4 of UK mortgages are on fixed rates. That sounds boring, but it's actually terrifying. Here's why. When the Bank of England started hiking rates in 2021, most homeowners didn't feel it immediately. They were locked into cheap fixed-rate deals from the pandemic era. Some are still on rates below 2%, but those deals are ending. The Bank of England estimates that 4.4 million households, nearly half of all mortgage holders, still need to remortgage onto higher rates between now and the end of 2027. When they do, their monthly payments are going to jump dramatically. We're talking about increases of £200, £300, even £500 per month for some families. That pain is still coming. The mortgage crisis hasn't even fully hit yet. So what's actually going to happen in 2025 and 2026? The forecasts are all over the place, but there are some clear trends emerging. Most major lenders and property analysts are predicting further house price growth of between 2% and 4% this year. That might not sound like much, but it means prices are going higher, not lower. For first-time buyers already struggling, that's devastating news. Every month they wait, homes become less affordable. Interest rates are expected to keep falling throughout 2025. The Bank of England has already cut twice, and markets are pricing in more cuts to come. Rates could end the year somewhere between 3.5% and 4%. That should help with affordability, but here's the catch. When rates fall, it tends to push house prices up because more people can suddenly afford to borrow. It's a double-edged sword. Inflation is slowly coming back down toward the Bank of England's 2% target. It's currently hovering between 2.8% and 3%, depending on which measure you look at. That's good news for rate cuts, but it also means the cost of living crisis isn't going away anytime soon. People are still being squeezed, wages aren't keeping up. The dream of home ownership is slipping further away for millions. But here's where the story gets really interesting. The UK property market isn't one market. It's dozens of different markets, and they're moving in completely opposite directions. Northern cities are absolutely booming. Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, Liverpool. These places are seeing strong, consistent price growth of 2% to 3% or more. Why? Because they're still relatively affordable compared to the south. Young professionals are moving there for jobs. Investors are piling in because rental yields are better. There's regeneration happening. Transport links are improving. These cities are on the rise. London and the South East are a completely different story. Price growth has basically stalled. In some parts of London, prices are actually falling. The average time it takes to sell a property in London has jumped 20% compared to last year. It's now taking 45 days on average to find a buyer. That's slow. Sellers are getting nervous. Properties are sitting on the market longer. The problem is simple. Prices in London and the South East are already so astronomically high that even with rate cuts, most people just can't afford to buy. A first-time buyer in London needs a household income of well over £100,000 to afford an average home. That's completely unrealistic for the vast majority of people. The market there is running out of buyers. This regional divide is only going to get wider. If you're a first-time buyer looking at London or anywhere in the South East, you're essentially priced out unless you have significant family wealth. The stamp duty changes hit these areas hardest because property prices are already above the new thresholds. Meanwhile, if you're in Manchester or Leeds, the market is still moving. It's tough, but it's not impossible. The geography of opportunity in Britain is shifting, and it's shifting fast. Now let's talk about something that's causing absolute panic among renters. Landlords are threatening to leave the market in droves, and if they actually do it, the rental crisis is going to get so much worse. Here's what's happening. The government increased the stamp duty surcharge on additional properties from 3% to 5% back in October 2024. Then, from April 2025, landlords buying properties between £125,000 and £250,000 face an extra 2% charge on top of everything else. Buy-to-let is becoming significantly more expensive from a tax perspective. Landlords are also dealing with higher mortgage rates, stricter regulations, and political pressure. Many are looking at their portfolios and thinking, it's not worth it anymore. If landlords start selling up, where does that leave renters? In theory, it could mean more properties come onto the market for first-time buyers. But in reality, most of those properties will be snapped up by wealthier buyers or other investors. Meanwhile, the rental supply will shrink. Fewer rental properties means even more competition for what's left. That means rents will keep climbing. Experts are warning that any increase in costs for landlords will be passed directly to tenants. It's already happening. Rents have never been higher, and there's no sign of them coming down. For the millions of people in Generation Rent, this is a nightmare scenario. They're already spending 40%, sometimes 50% of their income on rent. If rents keep rising, saving for a deposit becomes literally impossible. There's a really uncomfortable truth at the heart of all this that nobody wants to talk about. The UK housing market is designed to benefit people who already own property, and it punishes everyone else. If you're a homeowner, especially if you're mortgage-free or you bought years ago when prices were lower, rising house prices feel great. Your wealth is increasing. You feel richer. You can borrow against your home if you need to. You have security. But if you're young, if you're renting, if you don't have wealthy parents who can help with a deposit, rising house prices are a disaster. They represent a lifetime of financial struggle. They mean you'll never own your own home. They mean you'll be at the mercy of landlords forever. They mean you can't build wealth the way previous generations did. The ugly reality is that the British economy has become addicted to rising house prices. Governments are terrified of a crash because so much of the economy depends on property values staying high. Consumer spending, bank stability, pension funds, construction jobs. It's all tied to housing. So even though rising prices are destroying opportunities for young people, policymakers are quietly relieved when prices keep going up. They say they want affordability, but their actions show they want stability, which means keeping prices high. What's coming next is more of the same, but worse. Interest rates will keep falling slowly through 2025 and into 2026. That will give the market a boost. More buyers will be able to afford mortgages. Prices will keep rising, maybe 2% to 3% per year. That doesn't sound like much, but compound it over 5 or 10 years, and you're looking at homes being 15% to 30% more expensive than they are now. The wealth gap will widen. People with property will get richer. People without will fall further behind. Regional inequality will deepen. London might stagnate while northern cities boom, but that won't help Londoners who can't afford to relocate. The stamp duty volatility will settle down eventually. After the rush before April and the slump after, the market will find a new normal sometime in late 2025. But that new normal will be even less affordable than before. First-time buyers will need bigger deposits. They'll be older when they finally get on the ladder, if they ever do. More people will rely on the bank of mum and dad. Inheritance will become the primary way people acquire property wealth. That's not a healthy housing market. That's an aristocracy. Here's what needs to happen, even though it probably won't. Britain needs to build significantly more homes, not just any homes, but affordable homes in places where people actually want to live. The planning system needs reform. Councils need resources. Developers need incentives to build for regular buyers, not just luxury flats for investors. Stamp duty needs a complete overhaul. Taxing people for moving home is economically insane. It stops people from downsizing. It stops people from moving for work. It gums up the whole system. The tax should be on ownership, particularly on people who own multiple properties, not on transactions. Rents need to be controlled. This is controversial, but it's necessary. If rents keep rising at 9% per year, an entire generation will be financially crippled. Other countries manage this. Britain could too. The government needs to accept that the era of ever-rising house prices has to end. Not crash, not collapse, but stabilise. Prices should grow slowly in line with wages, not race ahead of them. That would mean years of flat or slightly falling prices to let wages catch up. It would mean some homeowners don't see their wealth increase, but it would mean a fairer society. It would mean young people have hope. None of this is likely to happen because it requires political courage, and housing is too politically sensitive. Too many voters are homeowners who don't want their wealth to shrink. Too many politicians own multiple properties themselves. The system is rigged to maintain the status quo, even though the status quo is unsustainable and deeply unfair. So here's the bottom line. The UK housing market survived high interest rates because of supply shortages, cash buyers, and wealth concentration among property owners. Prices didn't crash, they're still rising. The stamp duty changes created short-term chaos but won't solve the underlying crisis. Interest rates are coming down, which will probably push prices even higher. First-time buyers are being systematically priced out, especially in the south. Renters are trapped paying record rents with no way to save. Millions of mortgage holders are about to see their payments jump as cheap fixed-rate deals end. The regional divide is widening. The wealth gap is exploding. This isn't a functioning housing market. It's a crisis dressed up as success. Rising house prices are not a sign of a healthy economy. They're a sign of a broken one. Until we fundamentally change how we think about housing, treating it as a basic need rather than an investment vehicle, this crisis will only get worse. More people will be locked out. More wealth will concentrate at the top. More young people will give up on ever owning a home. If you found this deep dive valuable, make sure you're subscribed to Property Reporter. We're tracking every development in the UK housing market, bringing you the news and analysis you need to understand what's really happening. Hit that like button if this video opened your eyes to what's actually going on. Drop a comment and let us know your experience with the housing market. Are you a first-time buyer struggling to save? A homeowner worried about remortgaging? A renter watching prices spiral out of reach? We want to hear your story. The UK property market is at a crossroads, and what happens next will define the financial futures of millions. Stay informed, stay ahead, stay with Property Reporter. What if I told you that in Britain's biggest cities right now, single people working full-time jobs will never own a home? Not in 10 years, not in 20, never. And before you think this is just another story about lazy millennials who can't stop buying coffee, the numbers reveal something far more disturbing. This isn't happening because people aren't trying hard enough. It's happening because the system has fundamentally broken. And what's coming next will shock you even more. The UK housing market has reached a point that seems almost impossible to believe. In London and Bristol, if you're renting and earning an average salary, you're actually losing money every single month after paying rent and basic living costs. That's right, you have a deficit, you're going backwards. Recent analysis shows that the average London renter takes home around £3,000 monthly, but between rent at over £2,000 and basic living expenses, they're left with nothing. Actually, they're left £37 in the red every single month. But here's where it gets really interesting. While everyone's been focused on London, something completely different is happening in the North East. Property prices there have surged by over 14% in just 1 year. Meanwhile, London's barely moving at 1%. The housing crisis isn't what you think it is. It's not uniform. It's not simple. And the solutions being pushed by politicians, they're missing the point entirely. If you want to stay ahead of the latest UK property and housing news, the stories that actually matter, and the trends that will affect your financial future, smash that like button right now and subscribe to Property Reporter. We're cutting through the noise and bringing you the facts that the mainstream outlets won't tell you. Trust me, by the end of this video, you'll understand why everything you thought you knew about the housing market is wrong. The average house price in the UK right now sits at around £270,000. Sounds somewhat reasonable, right? But let's break down what that actually means for someone trying to buy their first home. The average first-time buyer deposit in Britain is now over £61,000. That's 20% of the purchase price. 20%. For most people in their 20s and early 30s, that figure alone is devastating enough. But in London, the average deposit has climbed to over £124,000, more than double the national average. Here's the reality that nobody wants to talk about. If you're earning the UK average salary of around £33,000 per year and you manage to save 10% of that, which is incredibly optimistic given rent and living costs, you're putting away £3,300 annually. At that rate, it would take you more than 18 years to save for a national average deposit. In London, you're looking at nearly 40 years. By that point, house prices will have increased so dramatically that your savings won't even matter. You'll be chasing a target that moves faster than you can run. Recent research examined exactly how long it takes for different groups to save for deposits. Single people living rent-free with family in London would need 16.7 years of dedicated saving to afford a deposit. In Bristol, it's 13.5 years. But if you're renting, the math becomes almost cruel. After paying rent averaging over £2,000 monthly in London, plus another £1,000 in living expenses, single earners on average income literally cannot save. The numbers don't work. It's not about discipline or sacrifice. It's mathematically impossible. And this brings us to something that most people completely missed. The regions seeing the strongest house price growth right now are actually the more affordable areas. The North East, North West and Scotland are experiencing growth rates multiple times higher than expensive southern regions. Why? Because people can actually afford to buy there. The market is functioning. In the unaffordable zones, everything has essentially frozen. There's a decade-high level of property choice for buyers in expensive areas because sellers can't find anyone who can afford to pay their asking prices. The market is screaming at us that prices have become detached from what real people can actually pay. Then came April 2025, and thousands of hopeful first-time buyers got hit with a bombshell they didn't see coming. The government had temporarily raised the stamp duty threshold for first-time buyers to £425,000 back in 2022. This meant if you were buying your first home under that amount, you paid zero in stamp duty. It was one of the few lifelines available. Everyone knew it would end eventually, but when it did, the impact was immediate and brutal. From April 1st, that threshold crashed back down to £300,000. Overnight, a first-time buyer purchasing a £400,000 home went from paying nothing in stamp duty to owing £5,000. For someone purchasing at £425,000, the bill jumped even higher. These aren't small amounts for people who've already stretched every penny to scrape together a deposit. For many, that extra £5,000 or £6,000 was the difference between buying and giving up entirely. The property market saw a massive rush in March as buyers desperately tried to complete before the deadline. Transactions spiked as people raced to get everything finalised. Then, in April, sales collapsed by 66%. That's the biggest drop following a stamp duty change in modern history. When similar changes happened before, the falls were around 50 to 60%. This was worse. Why? Because buyers are more cautious now. The economic backdrop is shakier. Wages haven't kept up. Mortgage rates, while better than their peak, are still significantly higher than a few years ago. People are tapped out. But here's what makes this truly revealing. The government knew this would happen. They announced it well in advance. The question is, what was the goal? Some argue it was a revenue measure that the Treasury needed the extra stamp duty income. Others suggest it was meant to cool an overheating market. But cooling what market? The affordable end where first-time buyers operate has been struggling, not booming. The only segment that's been consistently strong is the luxury market, where wealthy buyers, often international, continue purchasing regardless of tax changes. So who really benefited from this policy shift? Not the young families trying to get on the ladder. The stamp duty change exposed something deeper. The housing market has split into two completely separate worlds. In one world, wealthy buyers continue transacting, often purchasing multiple properties, barely noticing tax increases. In the other world, ordinary earners are being systematically priced out, watching as each policy change pushes ownership further beyond reach, and the gap between these two worlds is growing wider every single month. Now, let's talk about the trap that's keeping millions of people stuck. Renting in Britain has become a financial black hole. The average monthly rent in England has hit £1,410. In London, it's nearly £2,740. Wales is seeing rent increases of over 7% annually. The North East, despite having the lowest absolute rents, is experiencing the fastest growth rate at over 9%. Rents are rising everywhere, and they're rising faster than wages. Here's the cruel mathematics of it. Research shows that renters aged 19 to 29 are spending 34% of their income on housing costs. For low earners, that figure explodes to over 70%. The old financial rule said you shouldn't spend more than 30% of your income on housing. In 2025, that rule is dead. It's been obliterated. When you're spending 40 to 70% of your income just keeping a roof over your head, saving for a deposit becomes fantasy. The average renter has seen their annual housing costs increase by over £2,500 compared to just 3 years ago. That's £2,500 that could have gone toward a deposit, toward building a future. Instead, it's disappeared into rent payments that build equity for landlords, not tenants. And it gets worse. Housing benefit has been frozen. Universal credit is increasing by only 1.7% in 2025, while rents surge by 5 to 9%. The gap between what support covers and what rent actually costs is exploding. Experts predict this affordability gap will hit 17% by the end of 2025. That means low-income renters will face an average shortfall of over £100 per month between their housing benefit and their actual rent. By 2029, forecasts suggest that gap will reach 25% or £180 monthly. What happens to those people? Many face homelessness. Temporary accommodation is already at record levels. The crisis isn't coming, it's already here, and it's accelerating. But there's another layer to the rental trap that doesn't get discussed enough. Landlords have been leaving the market in significant numbers over the past few years due to tax changes and increased regulation. This reduces supply exactly when demand is surging. You'd think this would be the perfect time for institutional investors and build-to-rent developments to fill the gap. But new rental properties hit their sharpest decline since the pandemic in mid-2025. Supply is shrinking while demand grows. Basic economics tells you what happens next. Prices keep climbing until they hit what's called an affordability ceiling, the point where renters literally cannot pay more without collapsing. Several regions are approaching that ceiling right now. When it's hit, rents don't fall. People just get evicted or become homeless. Let me give you a number that should terrify everyone thinking about housing in Britain. 2.2 million. That's how many first-time buyers are missing from the property market since the 2008 financial crisis. These are people who, under normal historical circumstances, would have purchased homes by now. They had jobs, they saved what they could, they did everything right. But the system failed them. The market moved beyond their reach, and they got left behind. The average age of a first-time buyer in England is now 33 years and 10 months. A decade ago, it was a year younger. In 2007, before the financial crisis, it was more than 3 years younger. People are being forced to wait longer and longer. watching as property prices climb while they try desperately to save enough for a deposit. In London, the average first-time buyer is nearly 35. These aren't teenagers complaining about not getting instant gratification. These are people in their 30s, often with established careers, who still can't access home ownership. Here's something even more disturbing. Analysis shows that if a first-time buyer today manages to purchase a property with a typical mortgage, they won't be mortgage-free until they're 62 years and 10 months old. Think about that. You finally buy a home in your mid-30s after years of saving and sacrifice. You take out a 25 or 30-year mortgage because that's what's required to make the payments remotely affordable. You'll be paying it off until you're eligible for a pension. There's no building wealth in your 40s and 50s. There's just decades of debt. This has created what's now known as generation rent. These aren't people who choose to rent because they prefer flexibility or urban living. These are individuals and families who are permanently locked out of ownership. The numbers are stark. Only 8% of people aged 25 to 34 can afford to save a 10% deposit based on current house prices and wages. 8%. That means 92% of an entire generation cannot realistically access the property ladder without significant family help, inheritance, or some other external financial intervention. Research has found that home ownership is increasingly determined not by work ethic or financial discipline, but by circumstance. Do you have parents who can gift you a deposit? Did you inherit money? Do you have a partner whose income can be combined with yours to boost mortgage affordability? If the answer to these questions is no, your chances of ever owning a home have become vanishingly small. The system has evolved into one where property ownership is passed down through families, not earned through labour. It's becoming hereditary. The social implications of this are enormous. Home ownership has historically been tied to stability, to starting families, to feeling invested in communities. When an entire generation is denied that, what happens? Birth rates fall. People delay having children. Community cohesion weakens. Mental health deteriorates under the constant stress of insecure housing and financial precariousness. This isn't just an economic issue, it's a social crisis that will define Britain for decades. Now here's where the housing crisis starts to look really strange. The market has fractured into completely different realities depending on where you look. The North East has experienced house price growth of 14.3% over the past year. The North West and Scotland are seeing strong growth of over 4%. Meanwhile, London managed less than 1%. Some areas saw prices actually fall. Coastal regions like Torridge dropped by over 4.5%. What's happening here? The simple explanation is affordability. In regions where houses cost £200,000 or less, people on median incomes can actually buy. The market functions. Buyers exist. Sales happen. In London and the South East, where average prices hover around £300,000 to £500,000, ordinary people have been completely priced out. The only buyers left are those with substantial wealth, and there aren't enough of them to sustain robust market activity, so prices stagnate or fall. There's a fascinating dynamic in the most expensive areas right now. Property choice is at a decade-high level. Translation? Tons of homes are sitting on the market, not selling. Sellers who bought at peak prices or who need to move for work are stuck. They can't find buyers willing to pay their asking prices. Some have been forced to reduce prices significantly. Others have withdrawn their properties and decided not to move. The entire system has seized up because prices and wages have diverged so dramatically that the market can't function. Meanwhile, up north, things are different. Cities like Manchester, Liverpool, and Newcastle are seeing regeneration, business investment, and job creation. Combined with much lower property prices, this creates actual demand from real buyers. People can afford to purchase, the market moves. But here's the uncomfortable question. If you're being forced to move to the north because southern prices are insane, but your job, your family, and your life are all in the south, is that really a solution? Or is it just geographic displacement forced by economic inequality? Scotland presents a particularly interesting case. The country implemented rent controls for a period, capping how much landlords could increase rents for existing tenants. The goal was to protect renters from exploitation. What happened? Some landlords left the market, reducing supply. New rental properties became scarcer. When the controls were lifted, rents surged. The policy was well-intentioned but struggled against the fundamental problem of insufficient housing supply. You can regulate prices all you want, but if there aren't enough homes for everyone who needs one, the underlying crisis remains. Late 2025 saw something unusual happen in the UK property market. Activity ground to a halt about 6 to 8 weeks earlier than the usual pre-Christmas slowdown. Why? Budget uncertainty. The government had announced a major budget for November, and speculation was rampant about potential property tax changes. Would they increase council tax bands? Would they replace stamp duty with an annual property tax? Would they add capital gains tax on expensive property purchases? None of this actually happened, but the speculation alone was enough to freeze decision-making. Buyers at the early stages of their search paused. Why commit to a purchase when the tax landscape might change dramatically in a few weeks? Sellers held off listing properties for the same reason. Estate agents reported the sharpest drop in buyer demand and new listings in years. The entire market essentially stopped, waiting to see what the Chancellor would announce. This reveals something crucial about the current housing market. It's incredibly fragile. Confidence is brittle. People are so financially stretched, so uncertain about the future, that even the hint of policy changes causes them to freeze. Compare this to 10 or 15 years ago, when the market had momentum, when buyers felt confident about job security and income growth. Back then, speculation about tax changes might have caused a brief pause, but activity would resume quickly. Now, the pause extends for months. The market has lost its resilience because participants have lost their financial buffers. The political response to the housing crisis has been remarkably consistent across parties and decades. Build more houses, just build more. The current government has committed to building 1.5 million homes. Previous governments had similar targets. The logic seems obvious. If we're short on housing, build more housing. Problem solved. But there's a fundamental issue with this thinking that almost nobody wants to acknowledge. Britain is not an economy with unlimited, unused resources sitting idle. We don't have millions of construction workers twiddling their thumbs, waiting for someone to give them a job. We don't have vast stockpiles of concrete and steel gathering dust. Resources are finite, and they're controlled by people and companies that make economic decisions based on profit. If you're a construction company or a developer right now, what kind of housing are you going to build? Look at the economic landscape. Government finances are strained. The working class is impoverished. The middle class is squeezed. But the wealthy, they're doing better than ever. The richest segments of society have seen their wealth explode over the past decade. If you're a rational developer, you're going to build luxury housing for wealthy buyers because that's where the money is. You're going to build penthouses, not affordable family homes. You're going to focus on central London, not northern towns. You're going to maximise profit, which means targeting those who can pay premium prices. For affordable housing aimed at first-time buyers, developers will use the cheapest materials and methods possible because they know buyers have no leverage. People desperate to get on the property ladder will accept whatever they can get. This leads to a race to the bottom in terms of quality. Remember the Grenfell Tower disaster? That exposed how corners had been cut on building safety across the country. Affordable housing developments were using dangerous materials to save money. That's not an accident. That's the logical outcome when you tell developers to build cheaply for buyers who can't afford to be choosy. So when politicians say, build, 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 the question becomes, build what, for whom, and with whose money? If the answer is luxury housing for the rich built by companies maximising profit, that doesn't solve the affordability crisis. It makes it worse by consuming resources that could theoretically be used differently. And the idea that we should just slash regulations and planning requirements to speed up building, that's how you get Grenfell. That's how you get unsafe, poor quality housing that will become slums within a generation. There's another problem with the build more narrative. Asset prices have been rising across the board for years. It's not just housing. Gold prices have more than doubled since the start of the pandemic. Stock markets are at all-time highs. Land prices have surged. Luxury art, classic cars, farmland, every hard asset you can name has increased dramatically in value. If the housing crisis were truly just about not building enough houses, why would all these other assets be skyrocketing too? The uncomfortable answer is that this is fundamentally a story about wealth concentration and inequality. When a small segment of society accumulates vast amounts of wealth, they invest it in assets. They buy property, stocks, land, gold, anything that holds value. This drives up asset prices across the board. Ordinary people find themselves competing with billionaires and multimillionaires for ownership of homes. It's not a fair competition. It was never going to be a fair competition. The idea that you can build your way out of this without addressing the massive wealth inequality driving it is fantasy. Look at the rental market dynamics right now. Rental yields for landlords have climbed to 6% nationally, with some regions exceeding 7.5%. Returns have improved significantly over recent years as rents have surged while house prices grew more modestly. This has attracted more buy-to-let investment. The number of new buy-to-let mortgages increased by 60% in the year leading to early 2025. Wealthy individuals and institutional investors are piling back into rental property because the returns are attractive. What does this mean for renters and first-time buyers? It means they're competing for properties against people who can afford to pay cash, who can offer over asking price, who don't need mortgages. They're competing against investors who view housing as a financial asset, not as homes. The more concentrated wealth becomes, the more this dynamic intensifies. Every property purchased by an investor is one less property available for someone who wants to actually live in it. Some will point to the government's various schemes aimed at helping first-time buyers. The Mortgage Guarantee Scheme allows deposits as low as 5%. Sounds helpful, right? But a 5% deposit on a £300,000 home is still £15,000, and it comes with significantly higher mortgage rates because lenders view low deposit mortgages as riskier. Your monthly payments end up higher, eating into your already limited income. And you need to be able to borrow at least 4.5 times your salary, often more. For someone earning £33,000, that means borrowing about £150,000, which only gets you a modest property even in cheaper regions. There was brief excitement when Yorkshire Building Society launched a 1% deposit mortgage. You could buy a £500,000 property with just £5,000 down. Sounds revolutionary. But you need to earn over £100,000 annually to qualify for the borrowing required. How many first-time buyers are earning that? It's a product designed for high earners who perhaps spent money on other things and didn't save a traditional deposit, not for ordinary people struggling to get on the ladder. It's a marketing headline that doesn't solve the real problem. Here's what 2 decades of research and data have made abundantly clear. The UK housing affordability crisis is not primarily a housing crisis. It's a wealth inequality crisis that manifests most visibly in housing because everyone needs somewhere to live. When wealth concentrates in fewer hands, those hands buy assets. Housing is an asset. The wealthy buy housing, either directly or indirectly through mortgage lending. This drives up prices. Ordinary people get outbid, they get priced out, they lose. Historical data supports this. After World War II, Britain experienced a long period of relatively high equality by historical standards. During those decades, housing was affordable. Working-class people could buy homes. The system functioned. Then, starting in the 1980s and accelerating after 2000, inequality began rising sharply. The wealthy got dramatically richer. Asset prices began their long climb. Housing affordability deteriorated in lockstep with rising inequality. It's not a coincidence, its cause and effect go further back. In the Victorian era, when Britain had extreme inequality, housing was not affordable for ordinary people. Workers lived in slums or cramped tenements. Home ownership was the privilege of the wealthy. We had a brief historical moment of broad-based home ownership in the mid-20th century, but that was the anomaly, not the norm. As inequality returns to Victorian-era levels, so does Victorian-era housing unaffordability. History is repeating because the underlying economic structures are reasserting themselves. The shape of British cities is changing because of this. Historically, when a country has extreme inequality, you get very different urban forms than in equal societies. In equal societies, workers and consumers are the same people, distributed relatively evenly. Cities develop with mixed neighbourhoods because everyone has some money, everyone needs services. But in highly unequal societies, wealth and consumption concentrate in a small elite. Workers need to live near that elite to access jobs and money. This creates cities with ultra-luxury centres surrounded by vast sprawls of poor-quality housing. It's the model you see in many developing countries. London is increasingly moving towards that model. Luxury developments in Zones 1 and 2, expensive commuter towns for the moderately wealthy, then rings of increasingly dense, low-quality housing in outer boroughs as developers pack people in cheaply. Some policy experts argue for aggressive house building in outer areas and new towns to ease pressure. But without addressing inequality, this just creates segregated geography. The wealthy stay in desirable central areas. Everyone else gets pushed to peripheries with limited infrastructure, poor transport links, and cheap construction. It's not solving the crisis, it's managing the crisis by spatially separating winners from losers. The budget speculation that froze the market in late 2025 wasn't baseless paranoia. Governments around the world are wrestling with how to raise revenue without further destroying economic growth. Property taxes are attractive because property can't move. If you tax income too heavily, people might work less or leave the country. If you tax property, the property stays put. The landowner has to pay. Talk of replacing stamp duty with annual property taxes, of higher council tax bans, of capital gains tax on expensive purchases. All of this is in the air because governments are desperate for revenue. But here's the trap. If you tax property ownership more heavily, you make it even less accessible to ordinary people while barely affecting the wealthy. The rich can absorb higher taxes. Someone struggling to make mortgage payments can't. Every new property tax pushes more marginal buyers out of the market. It might feel good politically to tax property because it seems like taxing wealth. But unless structured very carefully, it ends up taxing aspiration while leaving concentrated wealth largely untouched. What would actually help? Policies that directly address wealth concentration, higher taxes on wealth, capital gains, and inheritance, lower taxes on work and earned income, massive investment in social housing that operates outside the speculative market, regulations that limit how much of the housing stock can be owned by investors rather than residents. Rent controls paired with guaranteed housing supply increases. These are difficult, complex policies that face fierce opposition from wealthy interests. So they don't happen. Instead, we get build, 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 which sounds simple but doesn't address the core problem. The UK housing crisis is at an inflection point. The system has broken down to such an extent that it's no longer functioning as a market in many areas. Buyers don't exist at current prices, sellers can't sell, renters can't afford rents but have no alternative. First-time buyers are locked out entirely unless they have family wealth. Each year, millions more people fall behind. The 2.2 million missing buyers since 2008 will become 3 million, then 4 million. The age of first-time buyers will keep climbing. Generation rent will become the permanent reality for larger and larger portions of the population. What happens when home ownership becomes the exclusive preserve of those who inherit it? When property ownership is passed down through families rather than earned through work, you get a society divided into a property-owning class and a permanently renting class. The property-owning class accumulates wealth through asset appreciation. The renting class pays rent to the property-owning class, transferring wealth upward. This isn't capitalism in the traditional sense of rewarding productive work. It's rentier capitalism, where wealth comes from ownership rather than labour. The political implications are profound. Historically, home ownership created political stability. People with mortgages and property had a stake in the system. They voted for continuity and gradual change. What happens when half the population has no property and no realistic prospect of ever getting any? Political volatility increases. support for radical change grows. The social contract phrase. We're seeing early signs of this already. Younger generations vote very differently from older generations, and housing is a major driver of that divide. Britain is not alone in this. Similar dynamics are playing out across much of the developed world. Vancouver, Sydney, Auckland, San Francisco, all facing versions of the same crisis. Young people priced out. Wealth concentration driving asset prices beyond reach. Governments struggling to respond effectively. The crisis is global because the underlying forces, rising inequality and wealth concentration, are global. Any solution has to grapple with that reality. So where does this leave us? The average house price in the UK is £270,000. The average first-time buyer needs over £60,000 for a deposit. In London, that climbs to £125,000. Rents are consuming 44% of wages, making saving impossible for most people. Stamp duty changes in April 2025 added thousands in costs for first-time buyers. 2.2 million potential buyers have been locked out since 2008. The average age of first-time buyers is 33 and climbing. Regional disparities show the market has fractured into affordable and unaffordable zones. Behind all of these statistics is a simple truth. Housing has become unaffordable because wealth has become extremely concentrated. Ordinary people are competing with the very wealthy for assets, including homes. They're losing that competition, and they'll keep losing it until the fundamental distribution of wealth and economic power changes. Build More solutions don't address this. Stamp duty tweaks don't address this. Mortgage schemes don't address this. They're treating symptoms while the disease progresses. The question facing Britain is whether this is acceptable. Is it acceptable for home ownership to become hereditary? Is it acceptable for an entire generation to rent permanently? Is it acceptable for families to be forced into poor quality housing or geographic displacement? These are political and social questions, not just economic ones. The market has given its answer. Prices are what they are because wealthy buyers can pay them. If society wants a different outcome, society will have to intervene in ways that directly challenge wealth concentration and asset ownership patterns. Nothing about this is inevitable. Policy choices created this situation. Different policy choices could change it. But those different choices would require confronting very powerful interests, redistributing resources and wealth, and accepting that the current system benefits some people enormously while harming others. That's a difficult political fight. It's much easier to say, build more houses and hope the problem solves itself. It won't. The data shows it won't. Every year we pretend otherwise is another year the crisis deepens. The UK housing market in 2025 is not a market in any meaningful sense in large parts of the country. It's a system where wealth buys assets and ordinary people get squeezed out. Understanding that is the first step toward changing it. The question is whether there's political will to take the second step. Something unprecedented is happening in the UK property market right now, and it's creating one of the most bizarre contradictions you'll ever see. Small landlords are racing to sell their properties in record numbers. Yet, at the exact same time, billion-pound institutions are aggressively buying up residential homes across Britain. Walk into a property auction today, and you'll witness buyers gazumping each other. Bidding wars erupting over every listing, prices climbing beyond asking. Yet turn on the news and you'll hear nothing but doom and gloom about landlords exiting the market in droves. So what's really going on? Is the landlord era ending, or is this the beginning of the biggest property consolidation Britain has ever seen? The answer is more shocking than you might think, and it all comes down to one thing. The autumn budget has fundamentally changed who gets to be a landlord in this country. If you want to stay ahead of the latest UK property and housing news that actually affects your financial future, hit that like button and subscribe right now. We bring you the facts the mainstream media won't tell you, breaking down exactly what's happening in Britain's property market every single week. The numbers tell a story that nobody wants to hear. According to the National Residential Landlords Association's latest quarterly survey, 26% of landlords sold at least some of their rental properties in 2024. That's more than 1 in 4 landlords choosing to exit the market. Just 4 years ago, That number was 22%. Even more concerning, 31% of landlords are currently planning to sell properties over the next 2 years, including 16% who plan to sell everything and leave the sector entirely. The government's own English Private Landlord Survey confirmed this trend, revealing that landlords in 2024 were significantly more likely to decrease their portfolio size than in any previous year. When asked about reletting vacant properties, only 61% said they would put the property back on the rental market, down from 75% in 2018. The exodus is real, it's accelerating, and it's about to get much worse. But here's where things get strange. While individual landlords scramble for the exits, institutional investors are flooding into the market like never before. Blackstone, the world's largest real estate investor, now manages 17,000 UK residential properties after investing £1.4 billion since late 2023. Pension giant Aviva has pumped £600 million into single-family rental homes since 2020, and they're planning to triple that investment within the next few years. According to property consultant Savills, institutional investment in UK single-family homes hit a record £1.5 billion in late 2023, more than triple the combined total for 2021 and 2022. In the first 3 quarters of 2024 alone, these big players acquired nearly 5,000 properties, marking a 20% increase from the previous year. Legal & General, M&G, Royal London Asset Management and major pension funds are all racing to expand their residential property holdings by hundreds of millions of pounds. The build-to-rent sector just surpassed £5 billion in institutional investment for 2024, marking the 5th consecutive year of record-breaking growth. So while mum-and-pop landlords are being squeezed out, corporate giants are building rental empires. The autumn budget, delivered on October 30th, fundamentally rewrote the rules of property investment in Britain, and it targeted individual landlords with surgical precision. Chancellor Rachel Reeves announced that stamp duty's higher rate for additional properties would jump from 3% to 5%, effective immediately. Think about what that means in practice. A landlord purchasing a £200,000 property now pays £10,000 in stamp duty, a £4,000 increase overnight. On a £300,000 property, that's £15,000 in tax before you even own the property. For context, if you're putting down a 25% deposit on that £300,000 home, your deposit is £75,000 and stamp duty alone adds another £15,000 on top. That's a 20% increase in your upfront capital requirement just to buy one property. But it gets worse. Capital gains tax rates also increased from 10% to 18% for basic rate taxpayers and from 20% to 24% for higher rate taxpayers on the sale of investment properties. Every property sale just became significantly more expensive, trapping landlords who might want to exit. The government estimates this stamp duty increase will generate 130,000 additional transactions for first-time buyers over 5 years, essentially admitting they're deliberately pricing landlords out of the market. What makes this particularly devastating is how these taxes stack on top of existing burdens that have been crushing landlords for years. Section 24, introduced back in 2017 by the Conservative government, fundamentally changed how rental income is taxed. Previously, landlords could deduct their mortgage interest payments as a legitimate business expense, just like every other business in Britain. Section 24 ended that. Now landlords pay tax on their full rental income, not their profit. A landlord earning £30,000 in rent but paying £25,000 in mortgage interest still gets taxed on the full £30,000, even though they only profited £5,000. This alone pushed thousands of landlords into higher tax brackets overnight. Then there's the existing stamp duty burden. Even before the recent increase, landlords were already paying 3% more stamp duty than regular home buyers. Combined with the baseline stamp duty rates, this created a significant barrier to portfolio growth. But nobody in government seems to care that legitimate business expenses are being ignored, that rental income is being taxed as if it's pure profit. The rules of fair taxation simply don't apply to individual landlords anymore. Now, here's where it gets interesting. And this is the part the government doesn't want you to understand. Section 24 tax doesn't apply to limited companies. That stamp duty surcharge doesn't hit institutional investors the same way. Capital gains tax on companies. Different structure, different rates, different rules. The tax code has essentially created two separate property markets, one for individuals and one for corporations, and the corporate track is far more favourable. A recent report showed that 46,000 buy-to-let limited companies were established between January and September 2024, a 23% increase from the previous year. That's more company formations in 9 months than during the entire year of 2021. Landlords are desperately trying to incorporate to escape the individual tax burden, but the cost and complexity of transferring properties into limited companies creates its own barriers. Capital gains tax hits you when you transfer properties into a company structure. Legal fees stack up. Mortgage products for limited companies often carry higher interest rates. For small landlords with 1 or 2 properties, incorporation might not even be worth it. Meanwhile, massive institutional investors like Blackstone, Aviva, and Legal & General were already operating as companies. They never paid Section 24 taxes. They're not hit as hard by stamp duty increases. Their structure was optimized for tax efficiency from day one. The game was rigged before it even started. The consequences of this exodus are already devastating for renters. Zoopla reported that rental supply remains 24% below pre-pandemic levels, while demand for rental properties sits 31% higher than before COVID. Just 256,000 rental homes were available by the end of 2024, a drop of 50,000 properties, or 16.5% in a single year. With supply plummeting and demand surging, rents have exploded. The average UK rent hit £1,872 per month, £70 more than 2023 and £520 higher than late 2019. That's a 38% increase in monthly rent in just 5 years. But the truly alarming statistic is this. According to Oxford Economics, only 1 in 8 renters can now afford to purchase a home in the area where they currently live. Think about that. 87.5% of renters are effectively trapped in the rental market with no realistic path to home ownership. And as landlord numbers shrink, those trapped renters face less choice, higher rents, and more competition for every property that becomes available. The NRLA reports that 7,100 households became homeless in a single quarter of 2024, specifically because their landlord sold the property. The policy intended to help renters by discouraging landlords is instead creating a humanitarian crisis. Yet, despite this obvious supply crisis, institutional investors see nothing but opportunity. They understand something crucial that individual landlords don't have the luxury of appreciating. Rental demand in Britain isn't going anywhere. The average age of a first-time buyer in the UK is now 34, up from 26 in 1997. An entire generation has been locked out of home ownership, forced into long-term renting not by choice, but by economic necessity. House prices have risen far faster than wages for decades, and with mortgage rates still elevated, that gap isn't closing. This creates a captive rental market that will persist for decades. Pension funds and private equity firms don't just see properties, they see 40-year income streams backed by desperate demand and shrinking supply. They're buying properties from desperate individual landlords at discounts of 15 to 20%, acquiring thousands of homes directly from struggling house builders who can't sell to owner-occupiers. They're partnering with developers to purchase entire developments before they're even built. And unlike small landlords who might sell when tax policy changes, these institutional players have the capital, structure, and long-term outlook to weather any storm. They're not worried about Section 24 or stamp duty surcharges because they were never meaningfully exposed to those taxes in the first place. The consolidation trend playing out in Britain mirrors patterns we've already seen in other countries, and the results should terrify anyone who cares about housing affordability or home ownership rates. In the United States, institutional investors now own a significant portion of single-family rental homes in many markets. In Germany, About 15% of rental housing stock is owned by institutions, compared to just over 2% in the UK currently. But that number is rising fast. Industry analysts predict UK institutional ownership could reach 8 to 10% within the next decade if current trends continue. And once institutional investors dominate a market, the entire structure changes. Professional landlords with massive portfolios can set rental rates based on sophisticated market analysis and revenue optimization algorithms, not based on covering mortgage payments and making a modest profit. They have legal teams, property management divisions, and lobbying power that individual landlords could never match. The relationship between landlord and tenant becomes purely corporate, transactional, and optimized for maximum return. The National Residential Landlords Association warns that this shift could permanently alter the character of the UK rental sector, transforming it from a market of individual property owners providing housing to one dominated by corporate landlords treating homes as financial assets. So what happens next? If current trends continue, Britain's rental market will look radically different within 5 years. Small landlords, battered by taxation and regulation, will continue exiting the sector. The government's own survey data suggests this trend is accelerating, not slowing down. Rental supply will continue shrinking as properties get sold to owner-occupiers or institutional investors, and very few new individual landlords will enter a market with such poor economics. Rents will keep rising because supply and demand fundamentals overwhelmingly favour landlords. The remaining institutional landlords will have pricing power that individual landlords never possessed. Renters will face a future where almost all rental housing comes from corporate landlords operating at scale, with standardised processes, aggressive rent collection, and optimisation focused solely on shareholder returns rather than tenant relationships. The pathway to home ownership, already nearly impossible for most renters, could become entirely closed off as housing costs continue outpacing wage growth. And younger generations will spend their entire adult lives renting, building no equity, creating no wealth, permanently locked out of the property market that previous generations used to build financial security. The most bitter irony in all of this is that policies supposedly designed to help renters and increase home ownership are achieving the exact opposite result. Every tax increase on landlords, every regulatory burden, every additional compliance requirement was justified as necessary to protect tenants and cool the housing market. But when you make it financially unviable for individuals to provide rental housing, you don't eliminate the need for rental housing. You just consolidate ownership in the hands of those wealthy enough and structured efficiently enough to survive the tax burden. The Conservative government introduced Section 24, and Labour just increased stamp duty and capital gains tax, but both parties implemented policies that benefit institutional investors at the expense of individual landlords and ultimately renters themselves. The big corporate players lobbying government have far more influence than scattered individual landlords ever could. And now Britain is sleepwalking into a future where residential property ownership becomes the exclusive domain of pension funds, private equity firms, and international investors, while ordinary people, whether they're trying to rent or buy, get priced out of housing security entirely. The data is clear, the trend is unmistakable, and the consequences are already unfolding. Small landlords are selling in record numbers. Institutional investors are buying in record volumes. Rents are rising faster than inflation. Supply is shrinking dramatically. Home ownership is becoming impossible for most renters. And government policy is accelerating every single one of these trends. This isn't a housing crisis anymore. This is a systematic restructuring of who gets to own property in Britain, and it's happening right now while most people aren't paying attention. The question isn't whether this transformation will continue. The question is whether anyone will do anything to stop it before the entire rental market becomes corporatized and home ownership becomes a luxury reserved exclusively for those who already have wealth. The UK housing market has stopped. Not slowed down, not cooled off, stopped. Right now, hundreds of thousands of potential buyers are sitting on their hands, refusing to move forward with purchases. Sellers are watching their properties languish on the market for weeks longer than expected. estate agents are reporting conversations that all end the same way. Let's wait until after the budget. But here's what most people don't understand. This isn't just pre-budget jitters. This is something far more calculated, far more deliberate, and the consequences could reshape British property ownership for a generation. What's really happening in the UK housing market isn't being reported in the headlines. The freeze you're seeing right now is just the surface. Underneath, there's a battle brewing between homeowners, the Treasury, and a government desperate for revenue. And on November 26th, everything changes. Before we dive deeper into this crisis, if you want to stay ahead of every major development in UK property and housing news, hit that like button and subscribe to Property Reporter. We're bringing you the analysis that mainstream media won't touch, the rumours Westminster doesn't want you to hear, and the data that reveals what's really going on in the British housing market. Let me show you the numbers that prove this market has frozen solid. Between now and the same period last year, buyer demand has collapsed by 8%. Sales being agreed are down 3%. That might not sound catastrophic until you realise this is the first annual decline in new sales agreements in 2 full years. The market had been recovering, mortgage rates had stabilised, and buyers were finally returning with confidence. Then the rumours started. Now, the usual Christmas slowdown that typically begins in late November has arrived 6 to 8 weeks early. Estate agents across the country are reporting the same phenomenon. Viewings are down, offers are being withdrawn, and chains are collapsing because someone in the middle has decided to wait. Wait for what exactly? Wait for the Chancellor to reveal her hand on November 26th. But here's where it gets sinister. The property market is currently sitting on the largest sales pipeline since May of 2021, when the post-pandemic property boom was at absolute fever pitch. Right now, almost 350,000 homes worth over £100 billion are stuck in limbo, working their way through the sales process. These are people who started their transactions months ago, who exchanged contracts before the panic set in, who are now trapped in a system that takes 5 to 6 months from agreement to completion. They're watching the news every day, terrified that the budget will introduce some new tax that makes their purchase more expensive overnight. Imagine being 4 months into buying your dream home, having paid for surveys and solicitors, only to wake up on November 27th and discover you now owe thousands more than you planned. The rumours swirling around Westminster aren't just gossip. They're strategic leaks, deliberate kite-flying exercises designed to test public reaction before the Chancellor commits to anything. And the proposals being floated are genuinely radical. First, there's talk of abolishing stamp duty altogether and replacing it with an annual property tax on homes valued above £500,000. Think about that for a moment. Instead of paying a one-time tax when you buy a property, you'd pay every single year you own it. The tax would supposedly escalate with property value, meaning someone with a modest home just above the threshold might pay a few £100s annually, while someone in a multi-million-pound property would face bills running into thousands. Supporters claim this would improve market mobility and spread costs fairly. Critics warn it would hammer homeowners in London and the South East, where even ordinary family homes regularly exceed £500,000. Then there's the capital gains tax proposal that has wealthy homeowners genuinely frightened. Currently, when you sell your primary residence in the UK, any profit you make is completely exempt from capital gains tax. It's one of the sacred pillars of British property ownership. Your home is your castle, and the government doesn't take a cut when you sell it. But now, rumours suggest the Chancellor is considering applying capital gains tax to primary residences valued above £1.5 million. The justification is that people who've benefited from decades of property price growth in expensive areas should contribute more to public finances. The reality is that this would disproportionately punish people in London and affluent southern regions, where property values have nothing to do with renovations or improvements and everything to do with location. Someone who bought a terraced house in Clapham 30 years ago for £80,000 could now be sitting on a £1.8 million asset through no effort of their own. Should they pay capital gains tax on that increase? The government thinks maybe they should dot. And it doesn't stop there. Reports suggest the Treasury is exploring an 8% national insurance levy on rental income. Right now, landlords pay income tax on their rental profits after deducting expenses like mortgage interest and maintenance costs. But national insurance has traditionally been exempt. If this change goes through, it would fundamentally alter the economics of being a landlord in Britain. Small-scale landlords, the people who own 1 or 2 rental properties as part of their retirement planning, would be hit hardest. Many are already operating on thin margins after recent tax changes removed their ability to fully deduct mortgage interest. Add an 8% national insurance charge on top, and a significant number will simply exit the market. They'll sell up, reduce the rental housing stock, and push remaining rents even higher. Tenants, ironically, would suffer most from a policy designed to extract more tax from landlords. But what nobody's talking about is that some of this has already happened. Back on April 1st of this year, stamp duty thresholds changed dramatically, and the market response was telling. Before that date, first-time buyers in England paid no stamp duty on properties worth up to £425,000. Overnight, that threshold dropped to £300,000. Suddenly, first-time buyers purchasing anything above £300,000 were facing thousands in additional costs. A first-time buyer purchasing a £350,000 property went from paying 0 stamp duty to paying £2,500. That might not sound like much to someone comfortably established, but for a young couple scraping together a deposit, it's devastating. The government knew this was coming. They announced it months in advance. And what happened? March of 2025 saw property transactions more than double compared to the previous March. People rushed to complete purchases before the deadline, creating an artificial boom that left estate agents working around the clock and solicitors drowning in paperwork. Then April arrived, and the market fell off a cliff. Transactions collapsed, buyer demand evaporated. It was predictable, inevitable, and entirely the result of government policy creating arbitrary deadlines that distort normal market behaviour. Now, with the November budget approaching, we're seeing the same pattern repeat. Buyers who might normally transact in November or December are pulling out, waiting to see what new costs might be imposed. Sellers who need to move are stuck, unable to generate interest because everyone's too nervous to commit. The geographic split in the UK housing market has never been more pronounced. Up in the northeast, house prices have risen by more than 6% over the past year. In some local authority areas, growth has hit 8% or more. Places like Middlesbrough and North Lanarkshire are seeing genuine price appreciation as buyers discover they can get far more space and quality for their money compared to southern England. Scotland and Wales are experiencing similar patterns, with solid growth driven by affordability and buyers relocating from more expensive regions. The northwest is booming. Manchester, Liverpool, and surrounding areas are benefiting from infrastructure investment, business growth, and a thriving rental market that makes buy-to-let properties attractive despite the regulatory challenges. But London is barely moving. Annual house price growth in the capital has been essentially flat, with some areas showing slight declines. The average London property is now worth around £296,000, but that figure masks enormous variation. Central London remains eye-wateringly expensive, propped up by international investors and wealthy buyers for whom a few £1,000,000 is pocket change. But outer London boroughs and commuter towns are struggling. Affordability has been stretched to breaking point. Even two-income professional households are finding it nearly impossible to get on the ladder without parental help or decades of saving. And now, with rumours swirling about new property taxes specifically targeting homes above £500,000. Anyone in London or the South East with a property anywhere near that threshold is understandably nervous. Here's the crucial detail that explains why properties above £500,000 are particularly affected. According to market data, about 20% of the UK property market sits above that value. But the distribution isn't even. In London, a huge proportion of family homes exceed £500,000. In the South East, particularly in commuter belts around the capital, ordinary 3- and 4-bedroom houses routinely hit or exceed that figure. Meanwhile, in the north, £500,000 buys you something genuinely impressive, perhaps even a small mansion. So when the government considers policies that use £500,000 as a threshold, they're not creating a tax on the wealthy. They're creating a tax on geography. They're punishing people whose only crime was buying a house in an area where prices rose faster than wages. The speculation around council tax reform adds another layer of uncertainty. Britain's council tax system is famously outdated, still based on property valuations from 1991. A modest terrace in an area that's since gentrified might be in Band B, paying relatively little, while a similarly sized property in a less fashionable area could be in Band D, paying significantly more. The system makes no sense. Everyone acknowledges it's broken, and successive governments have been too frightened to reform it because any change creates winners and losers. But now, reports suggest the Chancellor might introduce new council tax bands specifically for high-value properties. Homes worth over a certain amount, perhaps £1 million or more, would be placed in new premium bands with substantially higher annual charges. On paper, it sounds fair. In practice, it would disproportionately affect elderly homeowners who bought decades ago, have paid off their mortgages, and are now living on fixed incomes. Their homes might be worth a fortune on paper, but they're asset-rich and cash-poor. Forcing them to pay thousands more in council tax every year could drive them out of family homes they've occupied for generations. Landlords, meanwhile, are facing a perfect storm of challenges that goes far beyond the national insurance rumours. Over the past few years, successive policy changes have made being a landlord increasingly difficult and expensive. Mortgage interest tax relief was removed, significantly increasing tax bills for landlords with mortgages. Stamp duty surcharges were introduced, then increased, making it more expensive to purchase buy-to-let properties. The surcharge currently sits at 5% on top of standard stamp duty rates, meaning a landlord purchasing a second property worth £300,000 pays an extra £15,000 in tax compared to an owner-occupier. Energy performance certificate requirements are tightening, with landlords now required to ensure rental properties meet minimum efficiency standards or face substantial upgrade costs. Tenant protection legislation is expanding, giving renters more rights but reducing landlords' flexibility to manage their properties. The cumulative effect of all these changes is that small-scale landlords are leaving the market in droves. These aren't wealthy property moguls with vast portfolios. They're ordinary people who bought a second property as an investment, perhaps planning to fund their retirement with rental income. Now, they're finding the regulatory burden overwhelming, the tax treatment punitive, and the financial returns barely worth the hassle. When they sell up and exit the market, their properties often get purchased by owner-occupiers or by large institutional landlords with the scale and resources to manage complex compliance requirements. The result is a shrinking rental sector, higher rents due to reduced supply, and increased market dominance by corporate landlords who have far less personal connection to their tenants. What happens next depends entirely on what Rachel Reeves announces on November 26th. If she introduces aggressive property tax reforms, the market will experience another shock similar to the April stamp duty changes. Buyers will pull out of transactions, sellers will lower asking prices. The properties stuck in the pipeline will face delays and renegotiations as buyers demand price reductions to offset unexpected tax costs. Estate agents will see their workload collapse. Solicitors will deal with a wave of aborted sales. The construction industry, which relies on a steady flow of property transactions to drive demand for renovations, extensions, and new builds, will suffer. But if the Chancellor takes a more measured approach, perhaps announcing consultations on future reforms rather than immediate changes, the market might breathe a sigh of relief and return to something approaching normal activity. Market forecasters are split on what comes next. Some predict house price growth will finish the year between 1 and 1.5%, with modest continued growth into 2026. They point to stable mortgage rates, improving affordability as wages rise faster than prices, and underlying demand that hasn't disappeared, just been suppressed by uncertainty. Others are far more pessimistic. They warn that sticky inflation could keep interest rates higher for longer than expected, that mortgage rates might not fall as quickly as hoped, and that any significant property tax increases could trigger a genuine market correction. The truth is probably somewhere in between. The UK housing market is remarkably resilient, supported by chronic undersupply, strict planning rules that limit new building, and cultural factors that make home ownership a deep-seated aspiration for most British people. But resilience doesn't mean immunity. If the government imposes substantial new costs on home ownership, particularly costs that fall unevenly across different regions and property values, they risk creating distortions that could take years to unwind. Wealthy homeowners might accelerate plans to downsize or relocate, flooding the market with high-value properties just as demand is weakest. First-time buyers could be priced out entirely, trapped renting indefinitely while watching the ladder they're trying to climb get taller. Regional inequality could deepen, with London and the South East falling further behind northern regions where housing remains affordable. The rental market could become even more dysfunctional, with rents consuming ever larger shares of tenant incomes, while landlords struggle with rising costs and tightening regulations. Here's what's most frustrating for everyone caught in this freeze. The uncertainty itself is the problem. If the government simply announced its plans clearly, well in advance, with proper consultation and transition periods, the market could adapt. Buyers could make informed decisions. Sellers could price realistically. Agents could advise clients with confidence. Instead, we have rumour and speculation, leaked proposals and trial balloons, creating an environment where nobody knows what's coming and everyone's too scared to move. Property transactions are complex, expensive, and emotionally draining. They require commitment, trust, and a willingness to take on substantial financial obligations. When the government undermines that confidence by constantly threatening to change the rules mid-game, they damage not just the housing market, but the broader economy that depends on it. The most likely outcome from the November budget is a mixed bag. The Chancellor will probably introduce some property tax changes, but not the most radical proposals being discussed. She'll need to raise revenue to meet fiscal targets, but she also needs to avoid triggering a market collapse that would reduce transaction volumes and actually decrease tax receipts. Expect tweaks rather than transformation. Perhaps new council tax bans for very high-value properties. Maybe some adjustment to capital gains tax rules that affects second homes but leaves primary residences alone. Possibly some crackdown on tax avoidance schemes used by wealthy property owners. But wholesale abolition of stamp duty seems unlikely in the near term because it generates too much revenue and any replacement would take years to implement properly. What should buyers and sellers do right now? If you're in the middle of a transaction and genuinely need to move, pushing forward might make sense despite the uncertainty. Waiting indefinitely for perfect conditions means missing opportunities. If you're just starting to look and you're not under time pressure, waiting until after November 26th could provide valuable clarity. If you're selling, be prepared to be flexible on price. The market has shifted decisively toward buyers, with property choice at decade-high levels. Unrealistic pricing will simply result in your home sitting on the market for months, while similar properties priced more realistically get snapped up. If you're a landlord, carefully assess whether the economics still work for your situation. If margins are already tight and further tax increases are coming, selling might be the smart move before everyone else reaches the same conclusion. The bigger picture here is about Britain's relationship with property ownership. For generations, owning your home has been the foundation of middle-class wealth in this country. Property has been seen as a safe investment, a store of value, and a way to build intergenerational wealth to pass on to children. But if government policy increasingly treats home ownership as something to be taxed, regulated, and restricted rather than encouraged and supported, that cultural understanding will shift. Younger generations already priced out of home ownership might stop seeing it as an achievable goal and adjust their financial planning accordingly. International investors might look elsewhere if the UK property market becomes too expensive or complicated. Wealthy homeowners might relocate abroad, taking their money and their taxable income with them. The UK is not alone in grappling with these issues. Countries around the world are struggling to balance housing affordability, government revenue needs, and property market stability. Some have introduced annual property taxes similar to what's being discussed here. Some have wealth taxes that include residential property. Some have aggressive capital gains taxes on all property sales, including primary residences. The international evidence suggests these policies have mixed results at best. Annual property taxes can improve market mobility by reducing the one-time cost of moving, but they also create ongoing costs that burden elderly homeowners and anyone on fixed incomes. Capital gains taxes on primary residences raise revenue but discourage people from moving and can create bizarre incentives to spend money on consumption rather than invest in property improvements. Wealth taxes sound appealing, but are notoriously difficult to administer and often drive wealthy individuals to relocate to more tax-friendly jurisdictions. What's missing from the entire debate is an honest conversation about what we want the UK housing market to look like. Do we want widespread home ownership, even if that means accepting that house prices will generally rise over time? Do we want a larger, more professional rental sector, even if that means accepting that most landlords will be institutional investors rather than individual people? Do we want genuinely affordable housing, even if that requires massive building programs and reforms to planning laws that upset existing homeowners? Do we want to tax property wealth to fund public services, even if that means middle-class homeowners feel less wealthy and secure? These are genuine trade-offs with no easy answers. But making policy through leaked rumours and last-minute budget announcements without proper consultation or long-term strategy is the worst possible approach. The freeze in the UK property market right now is a symptom of deeper problems. It's a symptom of a government that desperately needs revenue but has limited options for raising it after ruling out increases to income tax, national insurance, and VAT. It's a symptom of a housing market that has become too expensive for ordinary people, but where existing homeowners resist any policy that might reduce their property's value. It's a symptom of regional inequality so extreme that houses in some parts of the country cost 10 times what similar houses cost elsewhere. It's a symptom of chronic undersupply, with planning rules so restrictive that building new homes is prohibitively difficult and expensive. It's a symptom of a rental sector squeezed between tenants who can barely afford rising rents and landlords who can barely afford rising costs and regulations. On November 26th, the Chancellor will step up to the dispatch box and reveal what she's decided. The property market will react within hours. If the changes are modest and well targeted, confidence might return relatively quickly. Buyers who've been sitting on the sidelines will re-enter the market. Sellers will adjust their expectations and accept that this is a buyer's market for now. Transactions will pick up as we head into the new year. But if the changes are aggressive and poorly designed, the freeze could deepen into something worse. Prices could fall sharply in affected areas. Transaction volumes could collapse. The sales pipeline, worth over £100 billion, could unravel as deals fall through and chains collapse. The economic ripple effects would extend far beyond the property market itself, affecting construction, home improvements, furnishings, removals, and all the other industries that depend on people buying and selling homes. So where does that leave us? The UK property market is frozen, not because of economic fundamentals, but because of political uncertainty. Buyers are waiting to see what costs they'll face. Sellers are stuck hoping their properties don't lose value before they can complete sales. Landlords are calculating whether it's worth staying in the market. Everyone is watching the government, waiting for clarity that should have been provided months ago. This isn't how a healthy property market operates. This isn't how responsible economic policy is conducted. And it's ordinary people trying to buy their first home or downsize for retirement or provide rental housing who are paying the price for this chaos. November 26th will bring answers, but the real question is whether those answers will restore confidence or deepen the crisis. The UK property market is holding its breath. In less than a month, we'll find out if it can breathe again or if it's about to suffocate under the weight of taxes it never saw coming. The UK housing market has stopped. Not crashed, not boomed, just stopped. October 2025 has seen something most experts didn't predict: a complete freezing of activity that's left buyers hesitating, sellers panicking, and estate agents wondering what just happened. Transactions that should be sailing through are stalling. Viewings that should be converting into offers are going nowhere. And properties that would normally sell in weeks are sitting for months. This isn't your typical autumn slowdown. This is something different. Something driven by fear, speculation, and a single date that's got everyone holding their breath. November 26th, 2025, the day Rachel Reeves delivers her autumn budget. The day that could reshape UK property forever. If you want to stay ahead of every twist and turn in the UK property market, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to Property Reporter. We bring you the latest housing news, market analysis, and the insights you need to make smart decisions in this crazy market. Don't get left behind when the budget drops. Let's talk numbers, because they tell a story that's almost hard to believe. Buyer demand has collapsed by 8% compared to this time last year. Sales agreed are down 3%. For the first time in 2 years, we're seeing an annual decline in people actually committing to property purchases. The average asking price crept up by just 0.3% in October. To put that in perspective, the 10-year average for October is 1.1%. We're looking at the weakest October price growth in over a decade. And here's where it gets interesting. Last October, the market was buzzing. People were rushing to complete purchases before the April stamp duty changes kicked in. Mortgage rates had just started dropping after that first base rate cut in 4 years. Confidence was building. Now, silence. The energy has been sucked out of the room, but the economy hasn't collapsed. Mortgage rates are actually better than they were last year. Employment is stable. Wages are growing. So what's changed? Why has the market essentially pressed pause? The answer is sitting in Westminster, being drafted behind closed doors right now. Everyone's afraid of what's coming on November 26th. The autumn budget has become the ghost haunting every property decision in the UK right now. And it's not just vague worry. There are specific, detailed proposals floating around that have got buyers and sellers genuinely spooked. The Treasury has been considering a radical overhaul of how we tax property in this country. We're talking about potentially scrapping stamp duty entirely and replacing it with something completely different. One proposal suggests an annual property tax on homes worth over £500,000. Not a one-time payment when you buy, an annual bill, every single year. The rate being discussed is around 0.54% for properties between £500,000 and £1 million, and higher for anything above that. Imagine owning a £700,000 home and suddenly facing a £3,000 annual tax bill that wasn't there before. Then there's the landlord situation. Reports emerged that the Treasury is considering charging national insurance on rental income. Currently, landlords pay income tax on their profits, but no NI. An 8% levy could raise up to £3 billion. For a landlord earning £60,000 in rental income, that's an extra £5,000 a year in tax, just gone, overnight. There's also been talk of introducing capital gains tax on primary residences worth over £1.5 million. Right now, your main home is protected from CGT. That's been a fundamental principle of UK property for generations. If that changes, it would represent a seismic shift in how we think about home ownership. And don't forget about council tax. The current system is based on property valuations from 1991, 34 years ago. There's speculation about new bands being added at the top end, or even a complete replacement with a modern system that reflects actual current values. Any of these changes alone would be significant. All of them together, it could rewrite the entire UK property landscape. And the problem is, nobody knows which ones are actually happening until the Chancellor stands up and announces them. The fear isn't hitting everywhere equally. It's absolutely hammering the top end of the market. Properties worth over £1 million have seen buyer demand drop by 11%. Homes between £500,000 and £1 million are down 4%. These aren't small numbers. These are the buyers with the most to lose from potential tax changes. They're the ones sitting on their hands, waiting to see what happens. London is getting destroyed. Prices in the capital are down 1.4% annually. The southeast is struggling too. These are areas where £500,000 doesn't buy you a mansion. It might get you a decent 3-bedroom semi. So when buyers hear about thresholds at £500,000, they're not thinking about millionaires. They're thinking about themselves. Compare that to the north. The northeast is seeing price growth of over 9%. Yorkshire is up nearly 4%. Scotland and Wales are both comfortably above 2% growth. Why? Because properties there are cheaper. A rumoured tax threshold at £500,000 doesn't scare someone buying a £200,000 house in Newcastle. It terrifies someone stretching to £600,000 in Surrey. We're watching the UK housing market split in two right before our eyes. One half moving forward, one half frozen solid. And the dividing line is whether you're above or below the rumoured tax thresholds. Here's what's really wild about this situation. The market has more properties available right now than at any point in the last decade. Sellers are listing, supply is there, but buyers aren't biting. Normally, high supply means prices fall until they reach a level where buyers step in. That's basic economics. But right now, buyers aren't responding to price cuts. They're not responding to better mortgage rates. They're not responding to anything except the calendar. They're waiting for November 26th. And that waiting is costing people real money. Rightmove data shows that properties receiving an inquiry on their first day of being listed are 22% more likely to find a buyer than homes that take over 2 weeks to get that first inquiry. In a normal market, that makes sense. Fresh listings get attention. But in this frozen market, even well-priced properties are sitting longer because buyers are simply not looking. Estate agents are reporting viewings happening with no follow-up. Offers being made and then withdrawn days later. Buyers getting cold feet not because of the property, but because of the budget. Sellers who need to move are stuck in limbo. They can't price low enough to overcome the fear factor. And they can't wait forever because life doesn't stop for government budgets. Divorces happen. Job relocations happen. Downsizing happens. People need to sell. But the market isn't cooperating. We're in this bizarre standoff where everyone's holding their breath and nobody wants to be the first to blink. Because what if you buy now and the budget introduces massive new taxes? You've just overpaid. What if you sell now and the budget changes nothing? You've just given up negotiating power for no reason. Paralysis breeds paralysis. And right now, the UK housing market is completely paralysed. So what could actually happen on November 26th? Let's break down the real proposals that are being discussed in detail, not just speculation. The stamp duty replacement is probably the most serious. The current system charges buyers a one-time tax when they purchase. It's expensive, it's lumpy, and economists have hated it for years because it discourages people from moving. The Institute for Fiscal Studies has called it economic nonsense. The proposed alternative would shift the burden from buyers to sellers and make it an annual charge. Properties over 500,000 would pay roughly 0.54% of their value every year after sale. Properties over 1 million would pay a higher rate. The theory is this would remove the barrier to moving while still raising revenue. The reality is it would fundamentally change the economics of home ownership for millions of people. Then there's the national insurance on rental income proposal. Currently, if you earn money from renting out property, you pay income tax on the profits, but you're exempt from NI because it's considered investment income, not earned income. The government is reportedly considering applying an 8% levy, the same rate employees pay, to rental profits. This would raise somewhere between £2 and £3 billion. For landlords, it would slash returns. Many are already facing higher mortgage rates, stricter regulations, and reduced tax relief on mortgage interest. Another big hit could push thousands out of the sector. And when landlords exit, they sell to owner-occupiers or other landlords. Either way, rental supply tightens and rents go up, so tenants end up paying for it. Capital gains tax on primary residences is the nuclear option. Your main home has always been CGT-free. It's one of the sacred cows of British property. But with the government desperate for revenue, some reports suggest they're looking at applying CGT to gains on homes worth over 1.5 million. This would overwhelmingly hit London and the South East, where modest family homes can easily exceed that threshold, and it would break a decades-old assumption that your home is your tax-free castle. Council tax reform is the least sexy but potentially most widespread change. The current system is insane. Your tax bill is based on what your property was worth in 1991. A flat that was worth $60,000 then might be worth $400,000 now. A house worth $200,000 then might be $2 million now. But both are still in the same rough tax bands. New bands at the top, or a complete revaluation, could shift billions in tax from poorer households to wealthier ones. Which sounds fair until you realise wealthier households vote more, donate more to political parties, and make more noise. Any of these happening alone would be big news. Multiple happening together would be historic. And the Treasury is apparently considering all of them. The irony of this entire situation is that doing nothing has become the most expensive option for many people. If you're a seller who needs to move, every week you wait is a week of mortgage payments, bills, and stress. Property sitting on the market for 3 months instead of 3 weeks costs you thousands in holding costs. Council tax doesn't stop. Building insurance doesn't pause. Energy bills for an empty property that needs to be heated for viewings keep coming. And if you're in a chain, you're holding up other people too, which means solicitors are circling. Estate agents are getting frustrated, and everyone's patience is wearing thin. The pressure is immense. If you're a buyer who's found the right place, hesitating could mean someone else with more courage swoops in. Or it could mean the seller pulls out of their own purchase chain because they're tired of waiting. There are stories emerging of buyers who had offers accepted in September, went through the survey process, got their mortgage offer, and then just stopped. Cold feet. Not because anything was wrong with the property, not because the survey revealed problems, just because the budget was coming and they wanted to wait. Now those sellers are back to square one. Property back on the market. Time wasted. Money spent on legal fees for nothing. The decade-high supply of properties means sellers have no pricing power. Buyers can negotiate hard right now, really hard. In a normal autumn market, sellers might expect to achieve within 5% of asking price. Right now, 10 to 15% under asking is becoming common for properties that have been sitting for a while. Buyers can make cheeky offers, and sellers are actually considering them because they know the alternative is sitting empty for months. But they're not, because they're scared. The rational move for a buyer right now is to lowball everything, knowing sellers are desperate. But buyers aren't being rational. They're being emotional. They're reading headlines about potential tax changes and thinking, what if I buy now and next month everything changes and I've made a terrible mistake? Fear is expensive. It costs both sides money. Meanwhile, interest rates aren't guaranteed to stay low. Mortgage rates have been gradually creeping up again as lenders wait to see what the Bank of England does next. The base rate is currently at 4%, Another cut is expected eventually, but the timing is uncertain. The bank's Monetary Policy Committee is caught between persistent inflation that won't quite die and an economy that needs stimulus. They're moving cautiously, very cautiously. Some economists predicted rates would be down to 3.5% by now. That hasn't happened. If you lock in a rate now and rates drop after the budget, you lose. If you wait and rates go up, you lose. And most mortgage offers are only valid for 6 months. So if you got an offer in September to beat the budget uncertainty, that offer expires in March. If your purchase hasn't completed by then, you need to reapply, at whatever rate exists then. It's a timing nightmare. The first-time buyer situation is particularly brutal. Many have been saving for years, finally have a deposit together, and now they're facing a market where sellers are desperate but won't drop prices enough because they're convinced the budget might change everything. First-time buyers already get better stamp duty treatment than existing homeowners. They pay nothing on the first £300,000, so the proposed changes to stamp duty might actually benefit them. But they don't know that for sure. And the uncertainty is paralysing them just like everyone else. So first-time buyers are stuck overpaying for properties in a frozen market, or waiting and risking being priced out if the budget fears turn out to be overblown and demand comes flooding back. Some are trying to time it perfectly, waiting until November 27th, the day after the budget, to start house hunting, assuming they'll have perfect clarity and can move fast. But they're not the only ones with that plan. If the budget turns out to be a nothing burger, you could see thousands of first-time buyers flood back into the market simultaneously. Demand surge, prices jump, and suddenly the properties they were looking at in October are out of reach. For landlords, the calculation is even more complex. If national insurance on rental income becomes reality, the returns on property investment drop dramatically. Let's do the math on a typical scenario. Say you own a property worth £400,000 with a £200,000 mortgage at 5%. Your annual mortgage interest is £10,000. Your rental income is £24,000 a year. After mortgage interest, maintenance, insurance, and letting agent fees, you might clear £6,000 in profit. You pay income tax on that. If you're a higher rate taxpayer, that's 40%. So you're down to £3,600 actual cash profit. Now add an 8% national insurance charge on the £24,000 rental income. That's another £1,920. Your £3,600 profit just became £1,680, more than halved. And that's before considering void periods, problem tenants, or major repairs. Some landlords are looking at those numbers and thinking it's not worth it anymore. They're preemptively selling up. But if they sell now and the NI change doesn't happen, they've exited a good investment for no reason. If they wait and it does happen, they're stuck with assets that are less profitable and potentially harder to sell because other landlords will be dumping property too. The landlord exodus has been happening slowly for years. Every tax change, every regulatory burden pushes more out. This could be the final straw for thousands. And when landlords sell, they usually sell to owner-occupiers, not other landlords. So rental stock decreases, supply and demand dynamics shift, rents go up, tenants suffer. The whole system groans under the pressure. Nobody wins in this environment, everyone's losing something, even if it's just time and opportunity. Estate agents are losing commission on deals that should have closed. Solicitors are losing fees. Surveyors are seeing fewer instructions. Removal companies are getting fewer bookings. The whole property ecosystem is feeling the freeze. And it ripples outward. Because property transactions drive spending on furniture, appliances, home improvements. When people move, they spend. When they don't move, that money stays in savings accounts. The economy feels it. November 26th is going to be a reckoning. One way or another, Rachel Reeves will step up to that dispatch box and the speculation will end. Either she'll announce sweeping property tax changes and the market will have to absorb a massive shock. Prices will adjust. Behaviour will change. The assumptions people have made about property for decades will need to be rewritten. Or she'll announce limited changes and all this fear will have been for nothing. The market will breathe a collective sigh of relief. Buyers who waited will rush in. Sellers who held out will feel vindicated. and estate agents will have the busiest December in years as everyone tries to complete before Christmas. Or, and this is possible, she'll announce consultations and reviews, kicking the can down the road and extending the uncertainty even further. This might actually be the worst outcome, because at least with definitive changes, people can adapt. With more uncertainty, the freeze continues, maybe into the new year, maybe into the spring market, maybe until next autumn. Nobody knows. What we do know is that this frozen state can't last forever. Human beings need to buy and sell homes. Life events don't wait for budgets. People get divorced. People have babies and need more space. People get job offers in other cities. People retire and want to downsize. People inherit property and need to sell. These things happen regardless of what Rachel Reeves says in Parliament. The spring market will come regardless of what happens in November. And when it does, pent-up demand will either explode if the fears were overblown, or the market will reset to a new normal if the tax changes are real. Think about it this way. If the budget introduces harsh new taxes, prices will have to fall to compensate. A property that would have sold for $600,000 in a world without annual property tax might only fetch $550,000 in a world with it. Buyers will factor the ongoing tax cost into what they're willing to pay. Sellers will have to accept lower prices or not sell. The market will find equilibrium. It always does. But it might take 6 months. It might take a year. During that adjustment period, transaction volumes will stay low, and that's painful for everyone involved in property. If the budget introduces no changes or minimal changes, the release of tension will be instant. Every buyer who was waiting will suddenly have no reason to wait. Every seller who was holding out for a better price will have leverage again because demand is back. You could see a surge in activity that pushes prices up in the short term, especially in London and the south where the freeze has been most severe. Supply is there, demand is there. It's just been suppressed. Remove the suppression and boom! The UK housing market has survived recessions, financial crises, pandemics, and countless government interventions. It survived the 1990s crash. It survived 2008. It survived Brexit uncertainty. It survived COVID lockdowns. It'll survive this too. But it might not look the same on the other side. The relationship between property ownership and taxation in this country could fundamentally shift. For generations, the deal was simple. You buy a home, you pay stamp duty once, you pay council tax annually. Your home appreciates tax-free. When you sell, you pay no capital gains tax on your main residence. That's been the framework. If that framework changes, millions of people will need to rethink their relationship with property. Is it still the safe investment it was? Is it still worth stretching yourself financially to get on the ladder? Is it still worth holding property for the long term? These aren't small questions. They're fundamental. The assumption that your home is your safest, most tax-efficient investment could be challenged. If you're facing annual property taxes and potential CGT on gains, suddenly property looks more like shares. Taxed going in, taxed going out, taxed while you hold. The advantage disappears. Why take on mortgage debt and all the hassles of home ownership if the tax treatment isn't favourable? Some people will still buy because they need somewhere to live, but the speculative element, the buy-to-let investors, the people treating property as their pension, they might look elsewhere, and that changes the market. The idea that landlording is a reliable path to wealth could be tested. The golden age of buy-to-let is probably over anyway. Mortgage interest relief is restricted, stamp duty is higher for second homes, regulations are tighter, evicting problem tenants is harder. And if NI gets added to rental income, the returns become mediocre. You could make better money in index funds without the hassle of tenants calling about broken boilers at midnight. So more landlords exit, fewer new ones enter. The professionalisation of the rental sector continues. Big corporate landlords with economies of scale take over. Build-to-rent developments multiply. The small private landlord becomes a relic of the past. Regional inequality could widen as the north and south diverge even further. If property taxes target homes over $500,000, that's a London and South East problem. Northern cities barely notice, so investment flows north. Development happens there. Jobs follow. Young people move there. Meanwhile, the South gets stuck in high-cost, high-tax, low-growth purgatory. We could see a genuine rebalancing of the UK economy, not because of some grand government strategy, but because the tax system accidentally makes it happen. We're watching history happen in real time, even if it feels like nothing is happening at all. Because sometimes the most significant moments aren't loud and dramatic. Sometimes they're quiet and tense. A market holding its breath, waiting for a single day, a single announcement, a single decision that could change everything. This is one of those moments. Years from now, people will look back at October 2025 as the month the UK housing market held its breath. The month before everything changed, or the month when everyone panicked over nothing. Either way, it's a moment that matters. So here's what you need to know right now. If you're buying, you have more power than you've had in a decade, but fear is stopping you from using it. If you're selling, you're fighting against a tide of uncertainty that has nothing to do with your property. If you're a landlord, the rules you've played by for years might be about to change. And if you're just watching, trying to understand what's happening, you're witnessing one of the strangest moments in UK housing market history. A market with plenty of supply, decent mortgage rates, stable employment and economic growth that's modest but positive. A market that by all normal measures should be functioning. But it's not, because sometimes fear matters more than fundamentals. Sometimes speculation matters more than statistics. And sometimes a single date on the calendar can freeze an entire market worth trillions of pounds. November 26, 2025. Market. Remember it, because the UK housing market will be different after that day than it was before. The only question is how different, and whether all this fear will have been justified or just another chapter in the long, strange story of British property obsession. Either way, one thing is certain. The freeze will end, the market will move, and when it does, a lot of people are going to wish they'd acted differently. The only question is whether you'll be one of them.